There are moments in history when fear itself becomes an empire. No banners, no armies, only silence, suspicion, and the sound of a key turning in a lock somewhere down the street. In that silence, the Gestapo was born, a secret police force that built its power not from numbers, but from the human mind. Imagine living in a world where every word might be overheard, every friendship might conceal a spy, and even your thoughts feel unsafe inside your own skull. You tell yourself you're careful, you say less, you trust less. And slowly, without ever seeing the bars, you begin to live inside a prison built of fear. This is how the Gestapo ruled, not merely through violence, but through the belief that resistance was pointless, that eyes were everywhere. It turned ordinary neighbors into informants, suspicion into loyalty, and obedience into survival. It was a system that did not need to watch everyone, only to make everyone believe they were being watched. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of that world, from the Gestapo's quiet rise in the ruins of post-World War I Germany to its vast reach across occupied Europe. We will see how it reshaped entire societies, weaponizing bureaucracy, psychology, and silence itself. We will step into the cells where screams were recorded as reports, and into offices where cruelty wore the mask of paperwork. But within this darkness, there were still sparks of courage, resistance, whispered in basements, smuggled letters, and fleeting acts of humanity that defied an empire of fear. As you listen, let the story unfold slowly. Let the noise of the present fade, and allow history to speak in quiet tones, not to frighten, but to remember. This is the story of how terror was organized, how it spread, and how, in the end, it consumed itself. You are listening to Lullaby of Empires, where the past does not sleep. It remembers, the whisper that became a storm. It began not with thunder, but with a whisper, a quiet unease that drifted through the weary streets of a defeated Germany. The First World War had ended, but peace had not followed. In the cafes of Berlin, men spoke in murmurs of betrayal, of humiliation, of a nation broken not by armies, but by signatures on a treaty. The air smelled of ink and resentment, of breadlines and burning paper money. Democracy, still young and fragile, trembled in the cold wind of disillusion. The Weimar Republic tried to speak the language of freedom, but its voice was drowned out by anger. In the shadows of this wounded nation, fear found its footing. Veterans returned from the front with empty pockets and haunted eyes, wandering between the promises of revolution and the threats of counter-revolution. Paramilitary bands clashed in the streets, their boots echoing on cobblestones slick with rain and blood. Each faction believed itself the savior of Germany, and each blamed another for its misery. Amid this chaos, a new kind of order began to whisper its way into existence. An order built not on law, but on loyalty. The whisper had a name: National Socialism. It moved quietly at first, carried in pamphlets and speeches that promised dignity to the humiliated and certainty to the confused. To many, the words felt like warmth after years of cold uncertainty. To others, they carried the chill of something darker, something ancient and vengeful stirring beneath the surface. When Adolf Hitler rose from obscurity to speak before crowds in beer halls, his voice seemed to give shape to every hidden frustration. He spoke of purity and betrayal, of renewal and revenge, and the people listened because they were tired of doubt. Germany, exhausted and frightened, began to crave simplicity. Freedom felt fragile. Control, by contrast, felt safe. In the yearning for stability, fear became a virtue, and it was from this fear that the Gestapo would one day be born. Long before the name Geheime Staatspolizei appeared on any document, the idea, all of it already lived in the hearts of men who believed that order could only come from obedience. The chaos of the early 1922 seemed to demand a savior, and in that demand, the architecture of dictatorship began to rise, brick by brick. The fragile Weimar police, overstretched and demoralized, could not contain the growing tide of street violence. Political murders went unpunished. Newspapers carried the names of victims no one remembered the next day. The rule of law became a memory. It was in these lawless streets that men like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler learned their first lessons in control. Both understood the power of fear, how it could break crowds faster than bullets. They watched as the early Nazi movement transformed chaos into choreography, turning rage into a marching rhythm. By the time Hitler seized power in 1933, the stage was set for something far greater and far more terrible than any ordinary police force. When the Reichstag burned, the whisper became a roar. Flames lit the night sky above Berlin, their reflection dancing on the faces of those who watched. The fire was more than destruction. It was opportunity. Within hours, the government declared a state of emergency, suspending civil liberties in the name of protection. It was the moment the Republic died, not with a coup, but with applause. Fear had finally found its master. The Gestapo was born in that fire's afterglow. At first, it did not even have its now famous name. It began as a secret division within Prussia's police, an instrument of political cleansing created under Göring's command. Its purpose was clear: to silence the enemies of the new Germany, communists, socialists, intellectuals, and anyone who dared to question the rising regime. What began as an agency for security quickly became a machine for conformity. Berlin's once vibrant cafes fell quiet. Books that had filled shelves with ideas were burned in public squares. Neighbors began to look at one another differently, no longer as friends, but as potential risks. The Gestapo had not yet learned its full power, but it already understood its most important weapon. Fear need not be everywhere to feel omnipresent. A single arrest could silence an entire street. A whispered rumor could destroy a life. In the early months, many Germans still believed this was temporary, a measure to protect the nation from extremism. But extremism was already in power. The Gestapo's offices multiplied, modest at first rooms filled with typewriters, paper, and men who had traded conscience for duty. The bureaucratic hum was almost peaceful, the kind of order that makes chaos feel distant. Yet every stamp, every signature, every report carried the weight of human lives. The men who served within these rooms were not monsters by appearance. They wore neat uniforms and wrote polite memoranda. They drank coffee, smoked cigarettes, and went home to their families. That was the secret of their power, the ordinariness of it all. Evil no longer looked extraordinary. It looked administrative. The Gestapo did not need to shout to terrify. It only needed to exist. Across Germany, fear seeped into daily life. People learned the new etiquette of survival to avoid political jokes, to lower their voices in public, to keep opinions behind closed doors. Schools taught loyalty. Workplaces hung portraits of the Führer. It was as if the entire country had fallen under a quiet spell, where silence became the safest language. The Gestapo's files began to fill not only with political opponents, but with ordinary citizens denounced by colleagues or neighbors. Betrayal became a form of virtue, and suspicion a civic duty. The machinery of terror grew in the spaces between words. No one saw the full picture, but everyone felt it. A knock on the door, in the middle of the night, the echo of boots in a hallway. The absence of someone who had been there the day before, these became part of everyday life. Each disappearance fed the myth of omnipotence. The Gestapo did not need to be everywhere. It was enough that people believed it was. And yet, in those early years, even the Gestapo was still learning. Its files were imperfect, its structure still forming, its methods not yet refined. What held it together was not efficiency, but ideology, a belief that the will of the state justified all things. Men were trained to see disobedience as disease, to cleanse society in the name of purity. Their loyalty was not to law, but to power. Every confession extracted, every arrest made, every rumor recorded was a thread in a web designed to capture the soul of a nation. By 1934, the Gestapo had expanded beyond Berlin. Offices appeared in Hamburg, Munich, Cologne, each a quiet node in a growing network of control. Its authority deepened after the Night of the Long Knives, when the regime purged its own ranks in a storm of blood and secrecy. That night, the Gestapo proved its loyalty by executing those who had once stood beside the Führer. The message was clear: obedience was survival, loyalty was life. The whisper that had begun in the chaos of Weimar now thundered through the heart of Germany. Citizens who once believed themselves untouched began to sense the chill. A friend disappeared for a careless remark. A teacher was dismissed for an unguarded sentence. A family moved away and was never heard from again. Yet life continued, shops opened, trains ran, children played in the streets. The genius of the Gestapo was not only in repression but in its invisibility. It allowed ordinary life to continue just enough for people to pretend nothing was wrong. In quiet apartments, radios hummed with propaganda voices promising strength, unity, destiny. The people listened, perhaps believing, perhaps only pretending to. Outside, posters smiled down from walls, urging vigilance, loyalty, silence. The new Germany was orderly, proud, efficient, and terrified. The Gestapo's early success lay in its balance of visibility and mystery. Its officers appeared rarely, but when they did, they left behind a void. People learned to police themselves. Suspicion replaced community. Silence replaced conversation. This was terror by design, a terror that required no army, no constant presence. The state had discovered that the most effective prison is the one built inside the mind. And yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred a quiet unease, a sense that control had come at too high a cost. The artists, writers, and thinkers who once gave Germany its soul either fled, were silenced, or turned their talents toward propaganda. The hum of creativity was replaced by the hum of machines. The Gestapo had not only conquered resistance, it had conquered imagination. By 1935, its reach extended beyond the borders of Germany. Political refugees were tracked across Europe, their letters intercepted, their names recorded. Informants sent reports from Paris, Prague, and Vienna. The Gestapo's shadow grew longer, darker, stretching toward lands it had not yet conquered. But still, in the heart of Berlin, its officers believed they were preserving order, safeguarding purity, protecting the state. The tragedy was not that they thought themselves villains, but that they thought themselves necessary. The transformation was complete when fear became ordinary. Children learned it from their parents, who learned it from their workplaces, who learned it from the state. The Gestapo had woven itself into the rhythm of life. Its victories were not measured in battles, but in silences, the conversations that never happened, the letters never written, the thoughts never spoken. In that silence, the whisper that had once promised salvation had become a storm that devoured everything in its path. The German people, weary of chaos, had found order, but it was the order of the graveyard, where even the wind moved cautiously. The Gestapo was no longer a department within a state. It was the state itself. And somewhere, beneath the quiet hum of typewriters and the shuffle of papers, the machinery of fear turned smoothly, preparing for the years when its reach would stretch far beyond Germany's borders, into every occupied street, every resistance cell, and every life that dared to remain free. The whisper had become a voice. The voice had become a command. And the world was beginning to listen, forging the shadow state. The new Germany was a country reborn in firelight. 1933 had cleansed the streets, they said, burned away weakness, and left only strength. But strength had a cost, and behind every parade and banner, something unseen was being built. While the crowds marched beneath red flags, while radios hummed with hymns to the Führer, quiet offices filled with paper, files, and men who understood that fear, properly administered, could rule more effectively than any army. Berlin was the heart of this new order. The city pulsed with a strange energy, part celebration, part dread. Once it had been a capital of ideas and noise, of jazz and arguments and restless dreams. Now, its rhythm had slowed, its color drained. Posters shouted loyalty, while the people whispered caution. In the corridors of power, Hermann Göring smiled the smile of a man who believed himself history's architect. To him, chaos was a resource, and out of that chaos, he began forging an institution that would make the state unassailable. At first, it was called only the Political Police Section, a small office in the Prussian Interior Ministry, answerable to Göring himself. Its purpose sounded simple: to protect the nation from subversion. But protection, in the language of tyranny, meant control. Göring's men raided communist meeting halls, arrested union organizers, silenced critics. The prisons filled quickly, their cells echoing with the footsteps of those who had once believed in freedom. The Bard of Odds abide. Gestapo, though the name was not yet official, learned its first lesson: that terror, when clothed in legality, could masquerade as justice. In those early months, power was fluid. The old police still answered to the laws of the Republic, while new men answered to no one but the Führer's will. Göring's brilliance lay not in innovation, but in audacity. He dismissed limitations, bypassed courts, and replaced law with decree. The secret police needed no warrants, no oversight. Suspicion was enough. A signature could end a life. By the summer of 1933, fear had become an administrative tool. The transformation from republic to dictatorship had been completed not on battlefields, but behind office doors. Then came Heinrich Himmler, the quiet, calculating man from Bavaria whose devotion to order was almost mystical. If Göring had built the foundation, Himmler would perfect the design. He brought with him a young protege named Reinhard Heydrich, sharp-faced, brilliant, merciless, a man who believed reason and ruthlessness could be the same thing. Together, they saw in the Gestapo not just a police force, but a weapon, an instrument that could remake society itself. Under their guidance, the Gestapo began to change form. What had been a tool of political survival became a mechanism of ideology. Its enemies were no longer merely communists or critics. They were anyone who did not fit the new vision of purity. Jews, pacifists, priests, teachers, and sometimes simply the unlucky. Files multiplied like roots underground. The paperwork of repression spread faster than fire, feeding on paranoia. Within months, the Gestapo had become the nervous system of the regime, connecting every whisper, every report, every glance of suspicion to the heart of power. Berlin's Prinz Albrecht Strasse, once an unremarkable street, became the nerve center of fear. Inside its gray buildings, corridors smelled of damp paper and cigarette smoke. Typewriters clattered, from morning until night, stamping out the rhythm of the new order. Behind closed doors, Heydrich mapped a system that reached into every province and town. Regional offices, district branches, informant networks, each link designed to feed the next. The men who ran them were chosen not for compassion, but for efficiency. Obedience was their creed, cruelty their currency. And yet, to the world outside, it all appeared curiously ordinary. Clerks walked to work, greeted one another politely, and filled their desks with pens and ledgers. In the evenings they went home to wives and children. Terror had learned to wear a human face. The Gestapo did not need monsters. It needed men who could type, men who could convince themselves that what they did was necessary. Himmler often spoke of purity, of cleansing the nation's soul through vigilance. He saw the Gestapo as the guardian of that purity, an invisible priesthood defending the faith of the Reich. But beneath his language of duty lay a deeper ambition, control over every organ of life. He sought to fuse police, party, and ideology into one body, the Schutzstaffel, the SS, with the Gestapo as its beating heart. Göring's creation was absorbed, its autonomy dissolved, its loyalty redirected. From this fusion arose the Reich Security Main Office, where information and repression became one. Heydrich, ever the strategist, transformed surveillance into art. He introduced the Carte vast card indexes, cataloging individuals by belief, background, and behavior. In dusty rooms, clerks sorted millions of entries. Each card represented a life under scrutiny, each mistake a potential death. The system had the cold elegance of machinery. It did not rage or shout, it processed. Humanity was flattened into categories: suspect, unreliable, dangerous, eliminated. With every update, the web grew tighter. No one knew exactly how many eyes watched them, only that they were never alone. Outside, the city moved as though hypnotized. People learned to perform loyalty, to recite slogans with just the right conviction. Teachers led children in salutes each morning. Clerks hung portraits of the Führer above their desks, and even laughter in cafes carried a cautious note. The Gestapo had no need to knock on every door. It lived rent-free inside every mind. Fear had become self-sustaining. In those years, loyalty was rewarded with safety, or at least the illusion of it. Citizens believed that only the guilty had reason to fear. They repeated the phrase like prayer, as if belief alone could keep them safe. But guilt was flexible. It could be rewritten, reassigned, rediscovered. One careless word, one unguarded opinion, could transform a patriot into an enemy overnight. The Gestapo's genius was its unpredictability. It struck not where resistance was strong, but where complacency was comfortable. Every arrest reminded the public that safety was conditional. Meanwhile, within the organization itself, rivalries brewed beneath the veneer of discipline. Göring still fancied himself its founder. Himmler saw it as his divine right. Heydrich treated it as his personal instrument. Their competition only sharpened the blade. Each sought efficiency, speed, perfection of control. New interrogation methods were tested. New categories of crime were invented. Political policing evolved into social engineering. The Gestapo was learning how to sculpt fear with precision, to make terror both invisible and inevitable. The regime's propaganda celebrated these men as defenders of order. Newspapers praised their vigilance. Films portrayed them as guardians, protecting Germany from internal decay. Citizens were encouraged to assist by reporting suspicious behavior. The result was a nation turned inward against itself. Families fractured, friends became informants. Every letter, every rumor, every argument could be weaponized. The Gestapo merely harvested what society freely offered. The whispering networks of the people became the lifeblood of the state. Inside headquarters, Heydrich watched it all unfold with clinical satisfaction. He saw information as power, and power as purification. The Gestapo's files, he said, were the mirror of the German soul, a mirror that reflected obedience or betrayal with equal clarity. His subordinates understood perfection meant omniscience, and if omniscience was impossible, the illusion of it would suffice. The myth of an all-seeing secret police was the most efficient invention of all. It required no army, no constant oversight. Belief did the work. Beyond Germany's borders, embassies and consulates reported the regime's growing confidence. Foreign journalists sensed unease, but were kept at a polite distance. What they glimpsed were parades and slogans, not prisons. The machinery of repression was hidden in plain sight, disguised as bureaucracy, wrapped in legality, powered by obedience. Even other Germans often did not understand the transformation taking place around them. They saw uniforms, not ideology, order, not submission. The state's descent into total control felt almost peaceful. Yet behind that calm surface, the Gestapo was expanding into new territories of thought. Files on churches, art circles, Student groups and private clubs accumulated. The regime no longer feared revolution. It feared imagination. Every idea not aligned with the Reich was a potential virus. Every gathering, a potential spark. The secret police became a ministry of silence, stamping out noise before it could turn to song. They measured loyalty in stillness. Himmler called it purification. Heydrich called it efficiency. Both meant the same thing: control perfected, until resistance became unthinkable. By 1936, their structure was complete. The Gestapo, now fully under SS command, operated with absolute independence. No court could question its actions. Its officers answered only to Himmler, and through him, to the Führer himself. The ordinary citizen, once protected by law, now lived under decree. The line between crime and suspicion vanished. Across the land, the sound of typewriters never ceased. Papers shuffled, stamps thudded, and the air smelled faintly of ink and fear. In small towns, new offices appeared, modest buildings with drawn curtains and polite signs. People learned to walk past without looking. In the evenings, lights burned long after midnight, casting rectangles of yellow onto wet cobblestones. Inside, clerks catalogued the latest denunciations, while officers drafted warrants that required no justification. The empire of paper was expanding, page by page. The men who served within it believed they were building eternity. They imagined history would remember them as guardians of order. Few realized that what they were constructing was not an empire, but a labyrinth, one that would eventually consume its builders as surely as its victims. But for now, they were triumphant. The shadow state was complete, and its reach endless. It could listen without ears, see without eyes, and kill without raising its voice. Outside, autumn settled over Germany. Leaves gathered in the gutters, swirling like embers as the wind passed through the empty avenues. In distant villages, the church bells still rang, but even their sound felt cautious, as though the air itself had learned to obey. The whisper that had begun years earlier had become a system, a living organism sustained by silence. The Gestapo no longer needed to assert itself. It was everywhere and nowhere, a rumor turned into law. And in the offices on Prince Albrechtstrasse, Heydrich stood at a window overlooking the city he now controlled. Below, people moved like shadows, unaware that each motion might already be recorded somewhere on a card, in a file, in a drawer. He thought of order, of destiny, of the perfection that awaited a world disciplined by fear. Behind him, the typewriters continued their patient rhythm. Click, pause, stamp, repeat the sound of a nation being organized into silence. The forging was complete. The shadow now had shape, and soon it would stretch across all of Europe. The silence of the streets. The city no longer spoke. It breathed in whispers. By 1936, Germany's streets had grown quieter than at any time in memory. The shouts and songs that once filled the avenues of Berlin were replaced by the hush of order, an order that smelled faintly of uniforms and rain. The Gestapo's work was invisible, but everyone felt it, like pressure in the air before a storm. Windows stayed closed now. Curtains were drawn even during daylight, as if sunlight itself might reveal something forbidden. Neighbors greeted one another with careful smiles that ended too quickly. Conversation became a delicate craft, measured and trimmed, stripped of risk. A misplaced phrase could travel faster than sound, carried by ears that listened for survival's sake. The Gestapo had mastered the art of silence. It did not merely punish disobedience, it made obedience instinctive. Across Berlin, posters urged vigilance, denounce the traitor, protect the fatherland. The words were patriotic on the surface, but underneath they planted a seed: trust no one. In cafes, laughter came softly. In offices, typewriters clicked in rhythm with paranoia. A man who kept to himself was suspicious. A man who spoke too freely, even more so. Between them lay the narrow path of safety, conformity. The Gestapo did not need to stand on every corner. Fear had deputized the entire population. Every district had its office, modest buildings with polite brass signs. Inside, corridors smelled of dust and cold tobacco. Clerks in gray suits sorted denunciations that arrived by post or telephone. Reports of a neighbor who grumbled about rationing, a teacher who hesitated before saluting, a priest who refused to replace a cross with a swastika. Each accusation was typed, stamped, filed. Most led nowhere. Some led to cells. The line between rumor and evidence was as thin as paper and just as easily burned. At night, the rhythm of the city changed. Car engines echoed through narrow streets. Headlights swept across shuttered windows. A door knocked after midnight carried the weight of a verdict. Those inside froze, listening to the footsteps, praying they would pass by. When they didn't, silence followed, the kind that neighbors pretended not to hear. In the morning, the street would look unchanged, except that one window would remain dark. The Gestapo's genius was not the arrest itself, but the emptiness it left behind. Factories, schools, churches, all learned the same lesson. Survival depended on vigilance. In classrooms, children sang hymns to the Führer, their small voices bright and innocent. They were told to watch, to listen, to report. Some did, proud of their obedience, others did not, but still feared that someone might report them first. Even families divided themselves in caution. Parents lowered their voices around the dinner table. Children learned the meaning of secrecy before they learned arithmetic. The home, once a refuge, became another theater of restraint. The Gestapo's numbers were small, barely 15,000 men for the entire Reich. Yet their reach seemed infinite. That illusion was their masterpiece. Every few weeks, state radio announced the arrest of saboteurs, traitors, defeatists. No details were given, none were needed. The mere existence of punishment kept millions in line. Fear became a currency, traded daily, invested in silence. In provincial towns, the change felt even deeper. The church bells still rang, but sermons had grown cautious. Farmers worked their fields under the same sky, but the conversations at the market dwindled. Letters to relatives abroad were shorter, more formal, stripped of anything that might be misread. The Gestapo's power was not that it could read every letter, it was that no one knew which ones it did. Uncertainty became the most effective form of control. Those who vanished left traces that were quickly erased. Employers received polite notifications, transferred to protective custody. Families were advised not to inquire further. The phrase itself carried its own warning. Few dared to ask what protective custody protected them from. It was easier to believe the words than to confront the truth behind them. Language itself had become a weapon, soft, bureaucratic, deadly. In cafes once known for art and argument, silence grew thick enough to hear the clink of every cup. The poets had fled, the journalists had fallen quiet, and the musicians played marches instead of jazz. Yet even here, the Gestapo's presence was mostly imagined, a whisper at the next table, a stranger reading too long behind a newspaper. The brilliance of terror was its efficiency. It needed only belief to function. The more people feared it, the less it needed to act. Still, some resisted the numbness. In small, hidden circles, words were spoken softly, defiantly. Pamphlets were printed in basements, passed from hand to trembling hand. A joke told in the wrong company could still ignite courage, but courage was costly. Arrests followed, quick and clinical. Names disappeared from mailboxes, and yet the whispers never stopped entirely. For every voice silenced, another whispered a little lower, a little closer to the ground. The Gestapo could terrify, but it could not fully erase the need to speak. In the capital, Heinrich Himmler expanded his vision. He saw Germany as a body whose health required constant inspection. The Gestapo were his doctors, diagnosing deviation, prescribing punishment. Reinhard Heydrich, perfected the method. Surveillance files grew into vast card indexes, each citizen reduced to traits, affiliations, suspicions. The categories multiplied: political, unreliable, moral suspect, racially mixed, potentially defeatist. The human soul became a ledger. By the late 1932, millions of names rested in drawers lined with green felt. Efficiency had replaced justice. Those inside the organization seldom doubted their purpose. They were told they were guardians of order, soldiers without uniforms. Some believed it, others simply obeyed. Obedience required no ideology, only habit. And habit, once learned, becomes nature. The secret police did not demand hatred from its clerks. It demanded neat handwriting. Evil had learned the grace of routine. In Munich, a man named Karl lived above a bakery. He had fought in the last war, lost a brother, and now repaired clocks for a living. One evening, a neighbor heard him complain about ration cuts and reported it, thinking little of it. 2 weeks later, Karl was gone. No trial, no notice, just absence. His shop remained open for a while, his clocks still ticking in their glass cases. The sound became unbearable for those who remembered him, so they stopped listening. The story was repeated in thousands of variations, each with its own silence. The Gestapo did not invent cruelty, it standardized it. By 1938, silence had become tradition. Children who had been 8 when Hitler came to power were now 15, and they had never known another rhythm. They spoke in slogans, thought in categories, dreamed in uniform. For them, fear was not extraordinary, it was normal, the air they breathed. The Gestapo had done more than police a nation, it had educated one. When Austria was annexed that March, the machinery extended effortlessly. Vienna awoke to the same rhythm Berlin had long known. Lists were drawn, arrests made, files opened. Jews, intellectuals, political opponents, all marked with the same precision. The silence spread across borders like fog. Within weeks, Austrian neighbors learned to lower their voices too. The empire of fear was expanding without resistance, one hush at a time. Inside Germany, success was measured in calm. Crime, rates fell, dissent vanished, the streets appeared orderly. Foreign visitors marveled at the discipline, the cleanliness, the sense of purpose. They saw flags and smiles, not shadows and absences. Few understood that quiet is not always peace. Sometimes, it is the sound of a society holding its breath. In the summer evenings, when the air was warm and the streets smelled of dust and gasoline, Berlin seemed almost beautiful again. Street lamps glowed softly on the Unter den Linden. Couples strolled beneath them. But behind the charm lay the knowledge that the city itself was listening. Microphones hidden in offices, informants in theaters, postal clerks, reading letters at random, all served the same design. The illusion of intimacy had been replaced by performance. People smiled, not for joy, but for safety. There were those within the Gestapo who began to sense the enormity of what they had built. A few tried to leave, to transfer to other departments, but once inside the web, departure was difficult. Secrets were chains stronger than loyalty, and so they stayed, convincing themselves that what they did was duty. The structure demanded participation, and participation demanded silence. In time, even doubt sounded dangerous. As night settled over Germany, radios murmured, with speeches promising destiny and renewal. The voice from the loudspeaker was confident, soothing, absolute. People listened, not because they believed, but because belief was easier than defiance. In small apartments, candles burned low. Shadows flickered on the walls. Somewhere, a typewriter continued to tap another file, another name, another whisper recorded. By 1939, the silence had become complete. The Gestapo had perfected what empires of the past had only dreamed of: domination without constant force. It ruled through imagination, through the fear of what might happen. It had turned the simple human need for belonging into a weapon. To be accepted was to be safe. To be different was to vanish. The line between loyalty and survival blurred until they were one and the same. And so, when the first guns of war sounded across Poland that September, Germany marched not only with soldiers, but with silence. The Gestapo had done its work well. A nation of millions moved as one, disciplined, obedient, convinced that unity was strength. The streets that had once echoed with debate and laughter now echoed with boots. The whisper had become a murmur, the murmur a chant. The storm was no longer coming, it had arrived. In the stillness before dawn, Berlin waited, unaware that the shadow it had built at home was about to spread across an entire continent. The Gestapo was ready. Its files were in order, its prisons prepared, its officers trained not only to listen but to act. The silence of the streets had been only rehearsal. Soon, the world itself would learn the sound of fear organized into power, policing thought. By 1939, the transformation of Germany was nearly complete. The regime had conquered not only the visible world, the press, the schools, the streets, but also the inner one. Thoughts had become suspect, opinions dangerous, and conscience a form of rebellion. The Gestapo's power had moved beyond walls and uniforms. It had entered the private corners of the mind. It began quietly, as all invasions of thought do. A new phrase entered official speeches: political reliability. To be reliable meant to think correctly, to interpret the world as the regime did. Disagreement was no longer an intellectual stance. It was a symptom of disease. The Gestapo became the doctors of this moral hygiene. They did not cure, they excised. Their purpose was to ensure that no idea could exist outside the boundaries of the Führer's will. At first, they went after the obvious targets: the communists, the socialists, the trade unionists, who had resisted since 1933. But once those voices were silenced, the net widened. Now it was the priest whose sermons hinted at mercy over obedience, the teacher who lingered too long on Goethe instead of Hitler, the scientist who questioned race theory. What began as political policing became a crusade against the independence of thought itself. The Gestapo's strength lay not in intellect, but in method. It reduced complexity to suspicion, turning every question into a possible crime. Investigations began not with evidence, but with whispers: a classroom remark, a misplaced book, an overheard doubt. Files multiplied. Each one represented an act of curiosity punished as subversion. In the Gestapo's worldview, ignorance was not a problem. It was proof of loyalty. Inside their offices, the process followed a ritual precision. An arrest order signed, a home searched at dawn, drawers opened, diaries confiscated. Books by banned authors were treated like weapons. A copy of Freud could condemn a psychologist. A line from Heine could doom a teacher. The secret police saw in literature what they saw in people: danger hidden beneath civility. Every word that inspired reflection was a rival to the state. And so, libraries were purged, and private collections burned quietly behind police courtyards. Among the interrogators, it was said that a confession proves the mind's weakness. They believed this justified anything. Inside the gray interrogation rooms, prisoners sat under bright lamps, the air heavy with smoke and fatigue. Questions were asked not to uncover truth, but to produce obedience. The goal was to make the accused repeat the words that would destroy them. Truth, under such conditions, became irrelevant. Confession itself was victory. The most tragic part was not the brutality, it was the banality. The men who questioned professors and priests were often poorly educated clerks, their power drawn not from knowledge, but from uniform and authority. They were trained to hear ideology as melody. Every note out of tune required correction. They did not debate, they recorded. In their notebooks, the inner life of a nation was translated into neat categories loyal, suspicious, dangerous, eliminated. Germany's universities, once among the brightest in Europe, grew dim under this new order. Lecture halls emptied of foreign scholars, replaced by party loyalists whose lessons mixed biology with politics. The Gestapo maintained files on students and faculty alike. A careless question during a seminar could end a career, or worse. Within a few years, entire departments devoted to critical thought disappeared, replaced by the study of obedience. Philosophy, once Germany's pride, became its victim. But policing thought required more than fear, it required participation. Citizens were encouraged to report incorrect thinking. Posters and radio broadcasts invited vigilance. It was not enough to love one's country. One had to love it in the right way. In cafes and factories, conversations turned cautious. Words chosen with surgical precision. The mind learned to censor itself faster than any Gestapo clerk could intervene. And that was the point. When thought polices itself, the need for police disappears. In rural towns, the boundaries between faith and fear blurred. Priests faced impossible choices: preach truth and risk the cell, or preach silence and keep their congregations alive. Many compromised, omitting words of compassion that might be mistaken for criticism. In confessional booths, sins of speech were whispered with trembling voices. "I spoke too freely," some said. "I doubted," said others. The Gestapo had turned confession into both spiritual and political currency. Even art was not spared. Painters avoided abstraction, writers avoided metaphor, musicians avoided melancholy. The state preferred clarity, images of labor, songs of loyalty, stories without ambiguity. The Gestapo understood that imagination was a kind of freedom, and freedom was dangerous. In their view, a canvas could be subversive, a poem a weapon, a melody a form of dissent. When the human spirit creates, it asserts ownership of its thoughts, and that, above all, was forbidden. Yet beneath the surface, resistance survived in quiet acts. A line of verse memorized in secret, a banned book hidden beneath floorboards, a letter written in code to a friend abroad. These were not grand gestures, but they mattered. They preserved the idea that truth could outlive its suppression. For every Gestapo raid, there were still minds that refused to yield entirely. Among the most remarkable cases was that of a librarian in Hamburg named Elise. She was ordered to remove degenerate literature from her shelves, works by Jewish, socialist, and pacifist writers. Instead, she cataloged them under false titles and hid them in a sealed storeroom. For years, she risked her life to preserve what the regime wished to erase. When the war ended, her secret collection became one of the first archives of banned literature in Germany. One woman, one room, and the courage to think differently. But such stories were rare. Most people adapted to survival. The Gestapo's success was not in breaking the few who resisted, but in convincing the many that resistance was useless. Fear became routine, absorbed into daily life. People learned to think in fragments, safe fragments, never allowing their thoughts to wander too far. A society that once produced Goethe, Kant, and Einstein now produced silence. The paradox was cruel. The Gestapo's ultimate goal was not to fill prisons, but to make prisons unnecessary. When fear is perfect, freedom polices itself. Germans who once whispered doubts learned to whisper apologies instead. The regime no longer needed to suppress speech. Speech had lost the will to exist. By 1940, as war engulfed Europe, this machinery of control had become seamless. The Gestapo's reach extended into every corner of occupied life, but its foundation remained the same: the conquest of thought. It trained millions to think collectively, predictably, and safely. In that mental uniformity lay its greatest victory. Within Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, officers congratulated themselves on maintaining internal harmony. Reports boasted of calm among the population and elimination of subversive tendencies. But behind these sterile words lay the quiet devastation of individuality. Minds no longer argued, questioned, or dreamed beyond permitted boundaries. The regime had achieved the unthinkable, the domestication of thought. And yet, beneath that still surface, something fragile persisted, the faint pulse of doubt. Even in the heart of conformity, there remained a part of the human spirit that refused complete submission. A schoolteacher who altered one line of the party anthem, a priest who slipped compassion into his sermons, a scientist who refused to falsify data, all tiny acts of rebellion, invisible to most, but immense in their courage. The Gestapo could suppress the voice, but not the capacity to imagine truth. It was this capacity that would later fuel resistance, long after fear had done its worst. But for now, in the dark years of the early war, thought itself was a battlefield. The Gestapo had no need for tanks or planes. Its victories were measured in silences. Each unspoken doubt was another conquest. Each obedient mind, another occupied territory. Outside, the war raged, but inside Germany, another war was being won, the quiet war for the human mind. It left no ruins, no smoke, no rubble, only silence. And in that silence, the Gestapo's empire stood triumphant, built not on land or wealth, but on the surrender of thought itself. When night fell, the radios whispered the same familiar words: victory, loyalty, destiny. Behind every glowing window, citizens listened, nodding in rhythm with the voice that had replaced their own. The streets were quiet again, almost peaceful. But beneath that peace lay a truth as chilling as the winter wind. Freedom had not been stolen. It had been given away, one cautious thought at a time. And so the Gestapo ruled not through armies or decrees, but through the quietest form of conquest, the colonization of the mind. The machinery of compliance, it began with order. To the outside world, the Reich appeared organized streets, swept clean, trains punctual, factories humming like metronomes. But beneath that rhythm was a deeper, quieter engine, the machinery of compliance, built by the Gestapo and perfected by those who feared it. It was not a machine of iron or smoke, but of paper, pens, and silence. It ran not on fuel, but on obedience. Every act of daily life had become a record, a form to sign, a statement to file, a declaration of loyalty to repeat. Bureaucracy became the skeleton of terror, clothed in the language of administration. The Gestapo did not rely on chaos, it relied on paperwork. There were orders in triplicate, typed in neat columns, sealed with ink and authority. Behind every beating, every disappearance, lay a form stamped "Approved." Inside Gestapo headquarters, the atmosphere was almost mundane. Desks aligned in rows, typewriters clicking, filing cabinets stretching wall to wall. A visitor might have mistaken it for a bank or an insurance office. Yet here, human lives were balanced like ledgers. The smallest suspicion, a rumor, a letter, a careless word, was converted into data. Every citizen existed in duplicate, the flesh and blood person and the file that shadowed them. Each file began the same way: surname, given name, address, occupation. Below that, a blank space for political reliability. That line held the power of life or death. Some files grew thick with reports, denunciations from neighbors, notes from block wardens, anonymous letters written in trembling ink. Others stayed thin, almost empty, until one day a new page was added. Subject arrested, reason preventive custody. Bureaucracy had replaced morality. The Gestapo's brilliance lay in how ordinary it all appeared. Orders did not shout, they whispered. Language dulled the horror. Torture became enhanced interrogation. Execution was special treatment. Deportation was resettlement. The machine used euphemism as grease. It ensured that those who obeyed could claim ignorance. The desk worker need not imagine what his signature unleashed. He only needed to sign. Among the clerks, there was pride in efficiency. Reports were judged not by their content, but by their clarity. An officer who kept his files well was praised. Promotions came not to the cruelest, but to the most organized. The Gestapo's cruelty was administrative, not emotional. Its power was not passion, but precision. It proved that evil could be executed with neat handwriting and punctuality. In the provinces, local offices replicated the model. Town halls became miniature engines of control, connected by telegraph and train to Berlin's central command. Every morning, couriers delivered bundles of reports, denunciations, surveillance updates, lists of those recently detained. The information flowed upward, the orders flowed down. There was no chaos, only process. And in that process, individuality dissolved. But compliance was not born of paper alone. It required belief, or at least the performance of belief. Citizens lined up to join state organizations, to wear badges, to sign oaths. To refuse was to stand out, and standing out was dangerous. Compliance became culture. Children joined the Hitler Youth not out of ideology, but because everyone did. Clerks joined the party because advancement required it. Fear disguised itself as patriotism and obedience as virtue. Every mechanism reinforced the next. Propaganda praised discipline. The Gestapo enforced it. Schools taught loyalty. Parents modeled silence. The press celebrated the vigilance of the people, turning denunciation into duty. Within a few years, the machinery ran without effort. It had built a nation that monitored itself. The Gestapo merely adjusted the gears. A single denunciation could set the process in motion. The accused would be summoned politely to an office, questions asked in calm tones. If answers wavered, the file thickened. Then came the temporary detention, which could last days or months or never end. For the officers, it was procedure. For the accused, it was the collapse of a world. Each step documented, signed, and filed away in cabinets that hummed with quiet purpose. In Berlin, an official named Friedrich supervised the processing of complaints. He prided himself on speed. Each morning, a stack of reports awaited his desk. Suspected defeatists, anti-state comments, unpatriotic behavior. He read them without emotion, stamped them verified or dismissed, then moved on. In the evenings, he returned home to his wife and children, dined in comfort, and spoke fondly of his office's productivity. He had never seen a prisoner, never heard a cry. To him, the Gestapo's victims were words on paper. This was the machinery's true genius. It separated cause from consequence. The man who signed the order did not meet the man it destroyed. The interrogator who broke bones did not read the reports that justified it. The crematorium worker who burned the dead did not see the ink that condemned them. Each cog turned, believing itself small, necessary, blameless. Together, they moved mountains of suffering. The bureaucracy of terror was not unique to Germany, but the Gestapo elevated it to an art form. Files replaced ideology. Signatures replaced bullets. It was the modern face of cruelty, cold, methodical, efficient. In earlier ages, tyranny had worn armor and brandished swords. In the age of the Gestapo, it wore spectacles and carried a pen. Even outside officialdom, the logic of the machine spread. Employers reported employees who seemed politically unreliable. Neighbors recorded visitors' names. Shopkeepers kept lists of customers who paid with ration coupons belonging to Jews or foreigners. Everyone, willingly or not, became part of the network. The Gestapo did not need an army of informants. It had built one from fear and habit. Yet beneath this precision, the human cost was immeasurable. Families lived in a constant state of vigilance. A knock at the door, a letter from the authorities, a sudden absence, all could mean ruin. Children grew up watching parents flinch at unexpected noises. Wives learned not to ask questions when husbands disappeared. The Gestapo's presence was so pervasive that even the innocent lived like the guilty. The machine thrived on repetition. Every arrest justified the next. Every confession proved the system worked. And every execution, quietly recorded and filed, made the next easier. In time, the machinery developed its own momentum, feeding on itself. Even as war consumed Europe, the Gestapo's clerks continued their rituals, processing paperwork for trains, prisons, and camps as if nothing had changed. In the corridors of Gestapo headquarters, the air grew thick with ink and resignation. Officers moved briskly, avoiding eye contact. They told themselves they were maintaining order, preventing chaos. But order had become an illusion. The machinery no longer served a purpose. It existed to perpetuate itself. Its gears turned because stopping them would mean confronting what they had built. A few within the system began to doubt. They whispered quietly in hallways, wondered about the files that vanished into higher offices. Some requested transfers to the front, preferring the dangers of war to the moral corrosion of paperwork. Most stayed. Habit, after all, is the strongest chain. By 1941, the Gestapo's machinery reached its peak. Across Europe, from Paris to Warsaw, its methods were replicated with chilling uniformity. Each occupied country received the same directives, the same forms, the same categories of suspicion. The paperwork of repression spoke one language, no matter the city. The Empire of Fear had found its universal grammar. In Warsaw, a young Polish clerk, conscripted into the Gestapo's local office, secretly copied deportation lists, smuggling them to resistance networks. He described the system as a machine with no soul. Yet even he marveled at its efficiency. Trains dispatched on time, prisoners processed with mathematical precision, reports filed faster than they could be read. The modern world had never seen evil so organized. And yet, for all its efficiency, the machine remained fragile. It depended on faith, the belief that orders were necessary, that obedience was moral, that paperwork absolved guilt. Without that faith, the gears would grind to a halt. The Gestapo's power was not infinite. It was sustained by millions who chose not to question it. As the war deepened, that faith began to crack. The machine still ran, but its hum had changed. Rumors of defeat, of atrocities, of camps in the East began to seep through the walls. Some officers worked faster, desperate to drown out the unease. Others grew careless, their reports sloppy, their files incomplete. Yet the machine persisted, carried by inertia. It is said that when empires fall, their ruins reveal the truth of their construction. The Gestapo's empire was no different. In its ruins, the Allies would later find the paper skeletons of millions of lives, forms, orders, memos, all neatly filed. Each document, a thread in the tapestry of obedience that had covered a continent in silence. The machinery of compliance had been precise, but never intelligent. It had followed logic without conscience, process without purpose, and in that precision lay its tragedy. For in teaching men to obey perfectly, it had unmade what made them human. The Gestapo's offices would one day stand empty, their files yellowing in the sun. The typewriters would rust, the stamps dry, the pens fall silent. But the system they represented the belief that paperwork can cleanse cruelty would outlive them, waiting for another age to rediscover its use. And when it did, somewhere in the quiet hum of administration, the faint echo of those typewriters would be heard again. Fear becomes law. It began quietly, with signatures and slogans. What the Gestapo understood better than anyone was that fear could wear the costume of legality. A rule was passed, a decree signed, and the impossible became normal. Each law promised safety. Safety from traitors, from spies, from the enemies of the people. In the beginning, few noticed the subtle shift. Law was no longer a shield, it was a weapon. When Hitler consolidated power in 1933, The machinery of justice became a mirror held up to tyranny. Courts once meant to protect citizens now existed to protect the state. Judges swore loyalty not to truth, but to the Führer himself. The Gestapo needed no prisons of its own. It had the courts to condemn and the police to deliver. But soon, even the courts proved too slow. Efficiency demanded autonomy. The Gestapo became judge, jury, and executioner. Its decisions final, its authority unchallengeable. The night Hitler signed the decree for the protection of people and state, civil liberty vanished with a pen stroke. The Reichstag fire had offered the excuse. Germany, they said, was under attack from within. From that night, citizens could be arrested without warrant, detained without trial, executed without evidence. Preventive custody became the Gestapo's favorite phrase. It sounded bureaucratic, almost harmless, yet behind it lay a universe of cells and screams. In the early months, fears spread unevenly. Some dismissed the arrests as politics, others believed them justified. Newspapers reported necessary detentions, assuring readers that the innocent had nothing to fear. But rumors grew. Teachers vanished. Journalists disappeared. Union leaders and priests simply stopped returning home. Fear, no. Longer wore uniforms, it wore silence. What made this transformation insidious was its logic. Every dictatorship begins by defining an enemy, and the Gestapo perfected the art. The enemy could be a communist, a Jew, a liberal, a dissenter, or anyone who hesitated before saying, "Heil Hitler." The category changed, but the need for an enemy remained constant. The public was told that vigilance was patriotism, and vigilance demanded suspicion. Fear became civic duty. In Berlin, propaganda posters showed a vigilant German man, eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon. "The state sees all," the caption read. But it was not the state that watched. It was everyone. Fear seeped downward, infiltrating conversations, dinner tables, even the whispers between lovers. Husbands began to measure their words before wives. Mothers warned children not to repeat what they heard at home. Within months, trust had become treason's twin. In offices, the transformation was almost invisible. Clerks who once processed taxes now processed arrests. Police who once patrolled markets now patrolled thought. The Gestapo's methods did not require visible brutality. Their genius was to make fear self-sustaining. When a few arrests were publicized, the rest of society disciplined itself. The law had become a mirror that reflected everyone's anxiety. In 1934, the Night of the Long Knives revealed what happened when fear merged with law. The Gestapo orchestrated and legitimized the massacre of the SA leadership, branding it a national emergency. Newspapers praised the swift justice. Hitler called it the cleansing of the nation's wounds. The message was unmistakable. Terror could be legal. Murder could be patriotic. The Gestapo had turned law into ritual, its ceremonies written in blood, but stamped with seals. Those who worked inside the Ministry of the Interior began to feel the shift in atmosphere. Legal experts, once trained to debate clauses, now drafted decrees that erased them. The concept of guilt dissolved. What mattered was danger. A man could be imprisoned not for what he had done, but for what he might do. Potential crime replaced actual crime. The law no longer measured actions, it measured loyalty. A case from Cologne in 1935 told the story plainly. A shopkeeper, accused by a competitor of making defeatist remarks, was taken for questioning. He had said only that business was slow and the future uncertain. The Gestapo officer smiled politely as he read the statement, then asked, "Do you doubt the Führer?" The shopkeeper hesitated one heartbeat too long. Within days, he was in a cell, his business confiscated. His file bore a simple note. Subject exhibits unreliable national sentiment. That line was all the law required. Over time, the Gestapo realized it did not need to fabricate many charges. The people would do it for them. Every society holds grudges, neighbors disputing fences, workers envying promotions, rivals seeking advantage. Under the Gestapo, such grievances found fertile ground. Denunciation became a weapon sharper than any knife. You could destroy an enemy with a letter. The law would do the rest. By 1936, fear was no longer an emotion. It was a routine. Schools began each day with oaths of loyalty. Churches echoed sermons that blurred faith and furor. The Gestapo's reach had entered the spiritual realm. Even God seemed to watch from the same direction as Berlin. Confession lost its sanctuary. Priests reported suspicious behavior to protect themselves. The sacred was no refuge from the secular terror. In rural Germany, the transformation was slower, but no less complete. Farmers listened to distant radio reports, half believing them. When a neighbor was taken away, they said nothing. Some pretended not to notice. Others told themselves it must be deserved. The Gestapo rarely needed to show force in such places. The empty chair at the tavern did the work. Fear had become local. Folklore and unspoken law older than paper. Inside the Gestapo's own ranks, fear also governed. Officers competed to prove loyalty, filing reports against one another. Paranoia was the true uniform of the organization. To survive, one had to show zeal. A careless remark at a party could end a career or a life. Thus, even those who enforced terror lived within it. Fear was not only their tool, it was their master. As the regime expanded its power, the Gestapo became inseparable from ideology. To question a decree was to question destiny. To doubt Hitler was to doubt Germany. Each law was wrapped in moral rhetoric, purity, order, unity. The public did not see repression, it saw renewal. When citizens disappeared, propaganda said they had gone for re-education, as if morality were a destination reached by train. The Gestapo controlled not just bodies, but language. In the universities, professors who once taught philosophy began writing treatises on racial hygiene and national security. The line between science and propaganda blurred until it vanished. Students learned that truth was whatever served the state. The Gestapo attended lectures quietly, taking notes. Dissenting scholars resigned, fled, or vanished. Those who remained learned to calibrate their words, shaping sentences that could survive surveillance. Thought itself adapted to fear. By the late 1932, the law had become theater. Trials were staged to display obedience. Verdicts written before proceedings began. The People's Court under Roland Freisler shouted more than it judged. Yet, each performance reassured the audience that justice still existed. The Gestapo had turned terror into spectacle, legal cruelty wrapped in ceremony. Citizens read about executions in newspapers and felt both horror and relief. Horror because it could happen to anyone, relief because it hadn't happened to them. The boundaries of legality eroded further with the annexations of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Each new territory brought new subjects to discipline, new laws to impose. The Gestapo's handbooks grew thicker, their language more abstract: protective custody, enhanced interrogation, preventive action, phrases designed to muffle conscience. When a system hides cruelty behind paperwork, it ensures that its servants sleep easily, even as their victims vanish. Some within Germany saw through the illusion. Lawyers like Hans Litten, who dared to challenge the regime in court, were themselves arrested and destroyed. His story spread in whispers. A man who once summoned Hitler to testify, now beaten to death in Dachau. His fate became a warning carved in silence. Justice itself had become treasonous. As Europe moved toward war, the Gestapo's role expanded once again. Fear was now exported like a product. Occupied lands inherited Germany's laws, its decrees, its methods. The same stamps, the same signatures, the same hollow words, appeared on documents in Polish, French, Dutch, and Czech. Across borders, the machinery of legality carried terror wrapped in paper. The law, which should have been the barrier against tyranny, had become its delivery system. What made the Gestapo's creation so enduring was its simplicity. It did not ask for belief, only compliance. It replaced conscience with procedure. It taught that the safest life was an invisible one. And by teaching that lesson, it built a nation of ghosts, citizens who moved, worked, and spoke without leaving traces of their true selves. In the evenings, as curfews fell and lights dimmed, the cities of Germany exhaled in uneasy quiet. Somewhere, a door closed too softly. A child asked why his teacher hadn't returned to class. The mother hesitated before answering. Outside, the posters still glowed in the lamplight. The Führer protects the people. Yet the people no longer knew who they were being protected from or for. Thus fear completed its transformation. It was no longer the reaction to power, it was power itself. It did not roar, it whispered. It moved through documents, through rumors, through hearts. And as the Gestapo's black cars glided through sleeping streets, law and terror had become indistinguishable. The nation that once dreamed of order now lived within it, an order colder and quieter than death. The invisible prison. The most effective prison is the one without walls. By the late 1932, Germany itself had become such a place, a vast silent cell where millions lived behind invisible bars. There were no guards at every corner, no fences slicing through streets, no cameras on the walls. Yet everyone moved, as though watched. The Gestapo had discovered that control did not need chains. It needed only the mind. It began with whispers. One man was arrested for a careless joke, another for doubting a rumor printed in the newspaper. A woman was taken because she lent a banned book to a friend. Each arrest sent ripples through a community. The Gestapo did not have to arrest everyone. It had only to arrest enough. The lesson spread faster than any directive could. Speak less, trust less, feel less. Silence was survival. Inside small German towns, fear became a local dialect. At bakeries, conversations ended abruptly when a new customer entered. In cafes, laughter faded the moment a stranger sat nearby. Churches echoed with hymns sung too loudly, voices competing to sound loyal. The state had turned life into theater, and everyone was an actor rehearsing obedience. The brilliance and the horror of this system was its economy. The Gestapo's manpower was limited. Only a few thousand officers controlled a nation of tens of millions. But fear multiplied their presence. It replaced their absence with imagination. People believed the Gestapo was everywhere, and that belief made it so. The myth of omnipresence became the Gestapo's greatest weapon. Posters showed eyes watching from shadows. Radio broadcasts reminded listeners of ever-vigilant protectors. Children learned that the Führer had 1,000 ears. Teachers told stories of traitors caught because they could not hide from the state's gaze. These were fairy tales of obedience, but no one dared call them fiction. In reality, the Gestapo's reach was woven through ordinary life. They did not have to spy on every home. Neighbors did it for them. The culture of denunciation grew like ivy, creeping through families, friendships, workplaces. A single word, unpatriotic, suspicious, enemy sympathizer, could unravel lives. One evening in Hamburg, an elderly widow named Marta sat at her kitchen table, reading by candlelight. She had kept her late husband's letters from the Great War, his handwriting now faded and trembling. In one, he had written of the futility of endless violence, calling war a fire that eats its own. When Marta read the line aloud to her neighbor, the woman smiled politely, but the next day, Marta was questioned. A file was opened. The words of a dead man had become evidence of disloyalty. Cases like hers filled the Gestapo's archives. Not conspiracies, not crimes, just fragments of life twisted into offenses. The power of the invisible prison was that guilt was not a matter of action, but of perception. One could be innocent and still be guilty, loyal and still be accused. The uncertainty was the point. In this new world, even the smallest gestures changed meaning. A glance could be suspicion, a pause could be defiance. The Gestapo taught people to interpret life through danger. Citizens became their own wardens, policing thoughts before words, words before deeds. It was a self-sustaining mechanism of repression. Fear breeding obedience, obedience feeding fear. Public spaces mirrored this quiet dread. Train stations, once places of arrival and departure, became landscapes of vigilance. Notices warned travelers to report subversive speech. Ticket clerks listened more than they served. The Gestapo rarely appeared in uniform here. They didn't need to. The atmosphere itself did their work. At universities, young students debated carefully. The brightest minds of a generation learned the art of restraint. In lecture halls, professors spoke in coded language, skirting forbidden ideas. A raised eyebrow could mean agreement. A cleared throat could mean caution. Truth became a secret whispered in stairwells. The invisible prison thrived in such places, its walls built from fear of one's peers. At night, radio static filled German homes. Families tuned to state broadcasts because foreign stations were forbidden. But some still tried to catch faint signals from London or Paris, turning dials in the dark. The risk was immense. If caught listening to enemy propaganda, punishment could be severe. Yet the act itself, the fragile defiance of static in the dark, became a kind of resistance, a quiet rebellion against the silence. The Gestapo understood that rebellion could begin in thought. Their task was to stop it before it breathed. They encouraged citizens to monitor one another, not out of malice, but out of duty. Parents reported children for disrespectful remarks. Students denounced teachers. The betrayal was always dressed in patriotism. "I only did what was right," they said, to protect Germany. Every denunciation was an echo of the regime's most powerful illusion, that loyalty meant purity, and purity meant fear. The people did not need to love the Gestapo, they only needed to believe that everyone else did. And so they conformed, not out of devotion, but isolation. In small villages, even laughter became dangerous. A farmer in Bavaria was reported for joking about Hitler's mustache. He was taken one evening, never to return. His neighbors stopped laughing after that. Years later, they would still remember the silence that followed his disappearance more vividly than his joke. What made this system endure was its emotional efficiency. Unlike open violence, invisible fear left no visible scars. People adjusted, rationalized, and told themselves that they were safe if they stayed quiet. And in that quiet, the Gestapo thrived. Yet, even within this machinery, there were moments of flickering humanity, tiny sparks in a dark sky. A clerk might delay a report, a policeman might warn a friend before a raid, a teacher might shield a student with vague grades that avoided suspicion. These acts were not rebellion in the grand sense, but they were defiance in miniature, fragile acts of conscience that risked everything. The Gestapo's power was vast, but not absolute. The human soul, however bruised, sometimes refused to kneel completely. The invisible prison extended beyond Germany's borders. In Austria, after the Anschluss, the same system took root overnight. Neighbors who once greeted each other with warmth now greeted each other with caution. In Prague, the Gestapo turned local informants into an invisible army. In Paris, fear spread through whispers before the uniforms even arrived. The Reich exported not just soldiers, but suspicion. The illusion of omniscience became a kind of religion. People prayed to be unseen, unheard, unnoticed. Churches and pubs alike became temples of silence. The most dangerous thing one could possess was an opinion. Even memories became suspect. Nostalgia for freedom was treason. And yet, beneath the surface of obedience, something else stirred a weariness deeper than fear. It began quietly, in long queues for rations, in the tired eyes of men returning from the front, in mothers whispering to each other about missing sons. The invisible prison was strong, but it was built on faith, and faith can falter. Still, for years, the illusion held. The Gestapo's true strength lay not in its weapons or its spies, but in its ability to make every person complicit in their own control. When people stopped questioning, the system needed no guards. When everyone whispered, the silence became law. In one of the countless reports found after the war, an officer wrote coldly, "The German people have learned to govern themselves in thought." He meant it as praise. In truth, it was tragedy, a confession of a nation that had been taught to think through fear. The invisible prison did not crumble overnight. Even after the war, many who had lived through it spoke softly, as though the walls were still listening. It takes time for silence to forget itself. The Gestapo had taught an entire people to equate quiet with safety. And that lesson, once learned, lingers long after the teacher is gone. History would remember the Gestapo for its torture chambers, its raids, its executions, but perhaps its most enduring weapon was the one that left no mark: the transformation of society into its own jailer. No empire of fear lasts forever, but the echoes of its whispers travel far. And as the 1,940 seconds dawned, those whispers spread beyond Germany's borders. The Gestapo's myth grew larger than life, feeding on conquest and rumor alike. In occupied Europe, the invisible prison became a continent. Fear no longer spoke German, it spoke every language. From control to conquest. When German troops crossed the Polish border on that gray September morning of 1939, the thunder of guns did not only announce the beginning of war, it marked the widening of an experiment, the export of fear. What had once been confined within Germany's borders was now unleashed upon an entire continent. The Gestapo, born from bureaucracy and rumor, was about to become an instrument of empire. As the Wehrmacht advanced, the Gestapo followed in its wake, not as soldiers but as shadow keepers. Their trucks rolled behind the tanks, their briefcases filled with files, warrants, and lists. They carried no flags. Their weapon was order itself, the cold, administrative certainty that followed invasion. While the front lines blazed with artillery, the Gestapo secured what the army conquered. In Poland, this new war had no illusions of mercy. The occupation began with decrees, curfews, and arrests. Within days, professors, priests, and intellectuals were rounded up, anyone capable of shaping thought. To the Gestapo, knowledge was resistance, and resistance was contagion. They called these operations intelligence measures, but they were, in truth, cultural executions. The sound of books burning mingled with the clatter of boots. The Gestapo's offices appeared overnight in seized buildings, town halls, police stations, schools. They arrived with desks and typewriters, transforming chaos into system. Every conquered city became a map of control, marked by interrogation rooms and prison basements. Fear had traveled efficiently. It needed no translation. In Warsaw, Krakow, and Lublin, posters warned of collective punishment for sabotage. A broken telegraph line, a missing patrol, a whispered joke could lead to executions. Behind the front lines, special Gestapo commandos joined the SS and army units in purges known as security operations. Their orders were precise: eliminate political enemies, exterminate racial undesirables, prevent uprisings before they began. Within weeks, thousands were dead. The names of villages disappeared into reports labeled "cleared of hostile elements." Bureaucratic language masked blood. What began as control soon evolved into annihilation. The Gestapo's intelligence divisions compiled names of Jews, communists, and Polish officers. Local collaborators were recruited, some from fear, some from greed, to provide lists and addresses. The machine of persecution now operated in 2 languages, German and compliance. In every town, new posters appeared, curfews, deportations, bans on gatherings. The ink dried before the people could comprehend what had begun. For the first time, the Gestapo extended its reach beyond ideology into geography. Entire nations were now under its watch. Yet, conquest did not make them omnipotent. It made them frantic. The more territory the Reich consumed, the thinner its shadows stretched. In Warsaw, a few hundred officers were responsible for millions, and so, as before, they relied on their greatest weapon, denunciation. Fear was franchised, replicated across borders, taught like a new language. Occupation became a school of silence. In cafes where Polish resistance whispered plans, a waiter might be an informer. In train stations, travelers spoke carefully, unsure if the stranger beside them carried a Gestapo badge. Families vanished overnight, their doors sealed with wax and stamped with the eagle of the Reich. To those left behind, the silence felt infinite. The Gestapo's war was not waged on battlefields, but in alleys, apartments, and cellars. Each occupied city developed its own rhythm of dread. In Paris, elegant avenues hid secret prisons. In Amsterdam, quiet canals reflected the ghosts of midnight arrests. The same patterns repeated with mechanical precision: intelligence gathering, infiltration, arrest, interrogation, disappearance. The blueprint of fear was standardized, efficient, and pitiless. In occupied France, the Gestapo's presence grew alongside collaboration. The Vichy regime became both ally and instrument. French police provided manpower. Local fascists provided enthusiasm. Gestapo officers, often numbering only dozens per city, orchestrated control through French hands. This collaboration gave terror a local accent, making it more intimate, more efficient. In Belgium and the Netherlands, the pattern was identical. Every whisper of rebellion, every rumor of dissent was met with swift retaliation. Posters declared executions in multiples, 10 hostages for 1 German life. The arithmetic of terror was meant to be simple enough for anyone to understand. Yet, the Gestapo was not content with repression alone. Their mandate expanded to counterintelligence, an invisible war within the war. Allied agents dropped by parachute into the forests of France and the fields of Poland, their radios hidden in haylofts. Within weeks, many were captured. The Gestapo's networks of informants and double agents spread through Europe's resistance like poison. They listened, waited, and struck at the moment of greatest trust. The war of shadows became as decisive as the one fought with bullets. A single betrayal could destroy an entire resistance cell. One intercepted message could lead to mass arrests. The Gestapo's files grew thicker, their prisons more crowded. Each name on a list was another victory in their silent campaign. But beneath the precision lay chaos. The more they conquered, the more they feared losing control. Reports from occupied cities described growing unrest and seditious elements. Orders from Berlin grew sharper, demanding absolute discipline through terror. The Gestapo obeyed with zeal. Fear was both their tool and their drug. In Eastern Europe, the lines between occupation and extermination vanished. In the wake of the advancing army, special Einsatzgruppen units worked side by side with Gestapo officers. Their mission: annihilate Jews, communists, and partisans. The Gestapo provided intelligence, names, and coordination. The death squads provided execution. The rhythm of this collaboration was chillingly bureaucratic. Lists were typed, trucks dispatched, fields selected, villages were surrounded, populations gathered. The gunfire that followed was often accompanied by meticulous paperwork, reports filed, numbers verified, signatures neat and complete. Bureaucracy and blood became inseparable. In cities like Minsk and Kiev, Gestapo men stood at the edges of mass graves, clipboard in hand. They were not soldiers but accountants of death, ensuring that orders were carried out to the last line. The machinery of annihilation required both cruelty and order, and the Gestapo supplied both in abundance. Farther west, in France and Denmark, the same offices that processed deportations of resistance fighters began coordinating the deportations of Jews. The distinction between political and racial enemies blurred until it disappeared entirely. Each transport required forms, permissions, and signatures. Each signature represented a life erased by ink. By 1942, the Gestapo's empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. Its officers spoke in numbers, arrests made, networks dismantled, elements neutralized. Their language was cold, yet their reach was warm with blood. What had begun as a force for internal security had become the executioner of Europe. But even as their power peaked, cracks began to show. In Poland, underground presses printed leaflets exposing atrocities. In France, the resistance assassinated informants. In the Netherlands, families hid Jews in attics and cellars, defying decrees written in the name of order. Every act of defiance, however small, chipped away at the illusion of control. The Gestapo responded with fury. Torture chambers grew busier, executions more public. For every rebel caught, others took their place. The war of shadows became a war of wills, the human spirit against the machinery of fear. One Gestapo officer in Paris wrote in his diary, "They are like weeds. You pull one out, and two grow in its place." He could not see that what he called weeds were, in truth, roots deep, unbreakable, waiting for spring. As the years passed, the Gestapo's files filled with more names than they could process. Cities burned, armies faltered, and still the paper flowed. Even as the Reich began to crumble under Allied bombardment, the Gestapo clung to its purpose, to control what could no longer be controlled. Their empire of fear had overreached, yet it continued out of habit, as though bureaucracy could halt the tides of war. In 1943, a train left Paris bound for the east, carrying hundreds of Jewish prisoners. Among them was a young girl clutching a diary. She wrote not of politics or ideology, but of clouds, sunlight, and hope. Her words would outlive the men who signed her deportation order. That was the Gestapo's ultimate failure. It could destroy bodies, but not meaning. The war they fought was never truly about borders or nations. It was about submission. They sought to prove that fear could govern the world. For a time, it seemed they succeeded. But fear, like all empires, consumes itself. The greater its hunger, the sooner it starves. By 1944, the Gestapo's empire began to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The same methods that had secured obedience now bred resentment. The same terror that once silenced voices now fueled rebellion. And as the armies of liberation closed in, the masters of fear found themselves haunted by the very ghosts they had created. The invisible prison had expanded across Europe, but walls built on fear crumble fastest when hope returns. And in the dim cellars of occupied cities, where men and women whispered plans by candlelight, that hope was already taking root. The Gestapo could control the body, but never the breath that carried a dream. Resistance and reprisals. Across a continent held in iron chains, something fragile yet indestructible began to stir. It moved in whispers, first notes passed beneath tables, coded messages in newspaper margins, chalk marks on doorways. The language of defiance spoke softly, but it spoke everywhere. From the forests of Poland to the rooftops of Paris, from the cobbled lanes of Brussels to the mountains of Yugoslavia, men and women began to resist the machinery of terror. And waiting for them, silent and merciless, was the Gestapo. To resist in occupied Europe was to breathe against the wind. Every gesture of defiance, printing a leaflet, hiding a fugitive, sabotaging a rail line, carried a death sentence. Yet the more the Gestapo tightened its grip, the more humanity seemed to find strength in the spaces between its fingers. In those spaces lived courage, and courage became contagious. In France, where the cafes that once hummed with laughter had grown hushed with fear, resistance began with ink and paper. Underground presses produced clandestine newspapers, Combat, Liberation, Le Franc-Tireur. Their pages smuggled across cities in bread baskets, coat linings, and bicycle frames. Each issue was a whisper of truth in a sea of lies. For the Gestapo, this was blasphemy. Words were bullets, and the printers of those words became targets. Gestapo offices in Paris swelled with reports of seditious activity. The war against paper became a war against people. Arrests followed swiftly, guided by informants and double agents. Interrogations took place at the infamous 84 Avenue Foch, where walls heard everything and told nothing. There, under the low light of interrogation lamps, resistance fighters met the state's quiet rage beatings, starvation, electric shocks, and endless questions that sought not truth, but surrender. Jean Moulin, the unifying figure of the French underground, became both legend and warning. Betrayed by an informant, captured, and tortured until unrecognizable, he never revealed the names of his comrades. In his silence, he became immortal. The Gestapo learned that fear could break bones, but not conviction. Still, they tried again and again. Elsewhere in occupied France, trains were derailed, supply lines sabotaged, and German officers ambushed in the night. For every act of defiance, there was reprisal. Villages were burned to the ground, civilians shot in retaliation for partisans' attacks. Fear was meant to smother resistance, yet each atrocity gave it breath. In Poland, the resistance was a living network, vast and disciplined. The Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, operated like a shadow government, complete with secret schools, underground courts, and military formations. The Gestapo's mission was to break it, an impossible task that consumed them. They filled their prisons with captured couriers, printers, and partisans. Yet the movement seemed to regenerate faster than they could destroy it. In Warsaw, the walls themselves became messengers. Graffiti declared Polska walczy, Poland fights. The Gestapo's response was merciless. Interrogations in Warsaw's Pawiak prison became infamous. Men and women alike were dragged from their cells, tortured for names, then executed or sent to concentration camps. The very presence of resistance justified endless repression. When the Warsaw Uprising erupted in 1944, the Gestapo answered not as policemen, but as executioners. Streets became rivers of blood. The destruction of the city was not a battle, it was a massacre. Still, even in ruins, Warsaw defied the Gestapo's arithmetic. The city's smoldering stones whispered a truth no report could conceal: that terror could destroy the living, but not the idea of freedom. In the Netherlands and Belgium, resistance took a quieter form. Families hid Jews in attics. Farmers sheltered British pilots shot down over occupied fields. Priests falsified baptism records to protect the hunted. Each act of compassion was a crime, and every crime was hunted. The Gestapo's Amsterdam office received endless tips, many false, some fatal. Denunciations poured in, and everyone became a thread in the web of fear. Among those captured was a young girl and her family, betrayed by an informant. The arresting officers didn't know her name, nor would it have mattered to them. Her diary, however, would one day become a voice stronger than theirs, a quiet chronicle of courage amid annihilation. The Gestapo's campaign against resistance was a war of invisibles. They fought shadows with shadows, using deception, infiltration, and betrayal as their weapons. Their agents posed as comrades, joining cells only to unravel them from within. Radios were traced, couriers followed, meetings ambushed. Sometimes entire networks were destroyed because one message was intercepted, one whisper overheard. In Denmark, where the resistance was still young, the Gestapo's precision seemed unassailable. Yet even there, humanity slipped through the cracks. In 1943, as deportations of Danish Jews began, word spread quietly through fishing villages. Overnight, fishermen and citizens ferried thousands across the sea to Sweden. The Gestapo's plans collapsed into confusion. Their carefully typed lists meant nothing against the unrecorded courage of a nation. In Norway, sabotage became art. Resistance fighters, trained by the British, infiltrated a heavy water plant critical to Nazi atomic research. Under the Gestapo's nose, they planted explosives, crippling one of the Reich's most guarded projects. The Gestapo's reports blamed enemy subversives, but they never found the saboteurs. In this unseen war, the smallest acts became victories. Everywhere the Gestapo went, they faced the paradox of terror. The harder they struck, the stronger their enemies became in spirit. Torture created martyrs. Executions created legends. Fear, when stretched to its limit, ceased to paralyze, it ignited. And yet, for those who fought, survival was uncertain. Many resistance fighters vanished into camps like Buchenwald or Ravensbrück, their courage recorded only in a few fading documents. Others died nameless in cellars, their screams absorbed by concrete. The Gestapo's efficiency was terrifying not for its size, but for its intimacy. They knew their victims by name, by address, by habit. Control was personal, repression was tailored. In Germany itself, resistance was rarer, but all the more astonishing. Students in Munich formed the White Rose, a circle of conscience in a city of silence. They printed leaflets condemning Nazi crimes, urging moral awakening. It was not sabotage or espionage, but something far more dangerous: truth. The Gestapo hunted them quickly. Hans and Sophie Scholl were caught distributing leaflets at their university. Within days, they were interrogated, tried, and executed by guillotine. Their crime was thought itself. The Gestapo celebrated their deaths as victory, but the echo of their words, "You will not destroy our spirit," outlived the regime. In a society governed by fear, the White Rose had dared to speak, and that alone was rebellion enough. The war between resistance and repression was not fought in balance. The Gestapo's power was vast, its reach overwhelming, yet resistance had something they could not quantify: faith in a future they could not see. Across occupied Europe, people risked everything to smuggle children, print truth, or simply refuse to bow. Each act was a thread in a tapestry of defiance that would one day cover the continent. For the Gestapo, this defiance was intolerable. They called it terrorism, treason, disease. Their vocabulary turned courage into contagion, but language could not hide what it was: the last human light in an age of darkness. By 1944, the Gestapo's campaign of repression reached its peak. They executed hostages in public squares, deported entire families, and burned villages suspected of aiding partisans. Their officers moved like ghosts through occupied cities, neither soldiers nor judges, but something colder, more abstract. They called it order. The world called it terror. Still, they never won. For every man they killed, another picked up the cause. For every network destroyed, two more were born. The Gestapo's reports, once filled with confident proclamations, grew increasingly desperate, full of warnings about unrest, insubordination, and infiltration. The empire of fear was being challenged by an army, without uniforms, without ranks, without borders. And in the end, it was not armies that began to undo the Gestapo. It was the refusal to surrender one's humanity. The farmer hiding a stranger in his barn, the mother lying to protect her son. the teacher who kept teaching truth behind closed doors. These small acts, multiplied across nations, created the slow, invisible rebellion that no terror could fully crush. The Gestapo's files found after the war tell this story in their own way. Thousands of names marked eliminated or neutralized stand beside thousands more marked unknown. Those unknowns were victories' lives that escaped their grasp, stories that could not be erased. The war between resistance and reprisals was not a war of equals. It was the collision of cruelty and conscience. But in that collision, something profound endured. Even under the weight of empire, people still chose defiance over despair. The Gestapo could command obedience, but not loyalty. They could inspire fear, but not faith. And when fear is all that binds a regime together, it begins to unravel the moment courage takes root. In basements, in forests, in whispers carried by the wind, Europe remembered itself. In the name of security, they called it Sicherheit security, a word that sounded clean, orderly, and necessary. But beneath its polished surface, security became one of the most dangerous words in the German language. It was a word that justified everything, a word that allowed cruelty to masquerade as duty, and persecution to disguise itself as protection. It was the banner beneath which the Gestapo spread across Europe, weaving terror into the daily fabric of life quietly, methodically, and always in the name of keeping the Reich safe. From the moment the Gestapo had been folded into the vast machinery of the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, its mandate changed from domestic policing to global control. Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, architects of this new empire of fear, no longer saw security as the prevention of crime. They saw it as the eradication of all uncertainty. A world where every whisper was known, every danger anticipated, every enemy destroyed before they could even act. In their eyes, order could exist only through total domination. Gestapo officers received their orders in the language of necessity. Each directive began with the same phrase, "For the security of the Reich." Those words appeared on arrest warrants, deportation lists, execution orders, and memos authorizing torture. The phrase had no limits. It could mean anything and everything. A Jew teaching children, a worker grumbling about rations, a priest refusing to salute, a housewife caught listening to foreign radio. All were threats to security. All were enemies to be eliminated. In Berlin, at the heart of the RSHA, offices buzzed with the hum of typewriters. Here, the Gestapo's bureaucrats translated ideology into policy. Files grew like weeds: dossiers, reports, surveillance notes, denunciations. They charted the invisible war against anything un-German, against anyone who could not or would not fit the mold. The men who managed these papers rarely saw their victims. They worked in silence, convinced that what they did was administrative, not moral. Paperwork turned persecution into procedure. The distance between ink and agony was only a signature away. Across Europe, Gestapo security detachments followed the Wehrmacht like shadows. Their mission was to cleanse newly conquered territories of subversives. It was a polite term for murder. In Poland, they executed intellectuals, priests, and teachers, the soul of a nation wiped out in weeks. In the Soviet Union, their security operations merged with the SS death squads, transforming villages into open graves. Security meant silence, not peace, but absence. The elimination of anything that could remind the world of its own conscience. Behind the front lines, in occupied capitals, the word gained new shades of meaning. In France, security meant collaboration. The Gestapo built alliances with local police forces, recruiting detectives, told himself he was protecting Germany, defending order, preserving civilization. But what they preserved was terror, disguised as normality. As the war dragged on, the Gestapo's obsession with security deepened into paranoia. Every defeat at the front became proof of internal weakness. Sabotage was imagined everywhere, in factories, hospitals, churches, even among the army. Desertion was no longer just a crime, it was treason. As Allied bombers tore the sky apart, Gestapo patrols roamed the streets below, hunting defeatists and rumor-mongers. Citizens were executed for saying the war was lost. Words became weapons, silence became survival. In bombed-out cities like Hamburg and Cologne, Gestapo officers moved through the ruins, clipboards in hand, recording the names of anyone who seemed uncooperative. Refugees arriving from the east were interrogated for defeatist talk. Even in collapse, the system functioned. Files multiplied. Fear endured. Security had become madness. A delusion that control could be maintained even as the world itself fell apart. There were moments, fleeting but real, when even the men of the Gestapo felt the edges of their own horror. Some officers drank heavily, unable to sleep, haunted by the things they'd seen or ordered. Others grew harder, duller, convinced that remorse was weakness. The machinery of repression demanded obedience, not reflection. Those who hesitated were replaced. The machine tolerated only motion. It could not stop, even as its creators knew the end was near. In the east, the Gestapo's security battalions continued their grim work, moving through Belarus and Ukraine, burning villages suspected of aiding partisans. Entire populations were annihilated in operations recorded as pacifications. Children, women, and the elderly were all listed as enemy sympathizers. Reports sent back to Berlin described these massacres in calm, clerical language: area secured, resistance eliminated, 327 persons processed. Numbers replaced names, order replaced empathy. And yet, somewhere within this vast darkness, a quiet irony lived on. The Gestapo, obsessed with control, was itself losing control. Their files became unmanageable, their informant networks confused, their communications intercepted. They had built a fortress of fear, but fear could not defend them from the truth, unraveling at the front. The empire of security was collapsing under the weight of its own paranoia. Still, they fought to preserve the illusion. New directives were issued from Berlin, insisting on uncompromising vigilance. Local commanders ordered mass executions of prisoners to prevent their liberation. In France, as Allied forces advanced, the Gestapo emptied prisons through death marches and shootings. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, trains still left for the camps, long after defeat was inevitable. Each act was justified with the same phrase, "for the security of the Reich." Even in ruin, they clung to the words that had excused everything. For the victims, security meant disappearance. A knock on the door at midnight, the echoing boots in a stairwell, the silence afterward. Families waited for news that never came, searching lists, asking questions, whispering names the world no longer recognized. The Gestapo had become the arbiter of existence, deciding who was safe, who was dangerous, who was nothing at all. In the chaos of 1945, when the Reich crumbled, the true meaning of their security was finally laid bare. The files, the prisons, the mass graves all spoke the same truth. That safety, built on fear, is not safety at all. It is a cage, and inside it, humanity suffocates. The Gestapo's empire of control had achieved the ultimate paradox, a nation so obsessed with security that it destroyed itself to preserve it. When Allied soldiers entered Gestapo headquarters across Germany, they found the remnants of that, illusions scattered among the ruins, burned documents, half-filled cells, desks still stacked with forms awaiting signatures. It was all so ordinary, and that ordinariness was the most terrifying thing of all, because it showed how evil had survived, not in chaos, but in routine. How the machinery of fear had functioned not through madness, but through method. The Gestapo's empire had called itself a shield against danger. In truth, it had become the danger itself. And in its collapse, Europe began to relearn what security was supposed to mean. Not silence, not obedience, not fear, but freedom. The machinery of fear. A regime built on terror does not breathe. It hums. It hums with the rhythm of typewriters, the click of boots on tile, the thud of files being stacked, the low murmur of voices reciting names. This was the music of the Gestapo's world, a cold, mechanical heartbeat pulsing through an empire of fear. Inside their offices, fear was organized, catalogued, and filed. It began with paper, reports of suspicious remarks, records of movements, notes from informants, all converted into numbers, names, and dates. Each person who entered the Gestapo's awareness became a file, a case, a line in a ledger. The humanity of the individual was reduced to the order of bureaucracy. Terror had a filing system. Rows of clerks sat beneath portraits of Hitler and Himmler, stamping documents with practiced precision. They did not shout or curse. They worked in silence, efficient and polite. Outside their windows, the world burned, but inside, there was order. This was not chaos, it was administration. The Gestapo had turned cruelty into paperwork, and in that paperwork, it found justification. A single file could end a life. A memo marked urgent, a form signed in ink, an arrest order scribbled by an officer who would never see his victim again. Each piece of paper carried the weight of death. It was a system so vast that no one could see its undertens, full shape, so detailed that it could suffocate without raising its voice. At the heart of this machinery was the illusion of process, the belief that every arrest, every interrogation, every execution had passed through some rational procedure. In reality, the Gestapo's structure allowed for boundless discretion. An officer could decide on guilt in a moment of irritation, a whisper of suspicion, or a flicker of ambition. There were rules, yes, but they were flexible, bent toward convenience, not justice. In the interrogation rooms, order dissolved into cruelty. There was no uniform method of questioning, only the certainty of pain. Suspects were forced to sit for hours under bright lights, forbidden to move, forbidden to sleep. Others were beaten, humiliated, or deprived of food until they confessed not to what they had done, but to what their captors needed them to have done. The machinery of fear had no interest in truth. It required only compliance. An officer once wrote in his report, "The suspect has admitted guilt and expressed gratitude for the clarity provided by interrogation." Gratitude. In the language of the Gestapo, even brokenness was dressed as cooperation. The design of their offices reflected the structure of their power: plain, cold, and functional. Concrete corridors, steel doors, small rooms with a single chair, a desk, and the faint smell of disinfectant. Nothing was excessive, nothing was decorative. Efficiency was the aesthetic of oppression. The walls absorbed screams and returned silence. In Berlin's Prinz Albrechtstrasse headquarters, the air was heavy with the scent of tobacco and damp paper. Men in uniforms walked briskly between floors, carrying folders tied with string. Behind closed doors, confessions were extracted, names written down, and new arrests ordered. The rhythm never stopped, each day feeding the next, each decision creating new decisions. What made this machinery so powerful was not only its brutality, but its precision. Fear was administered like policy, measured in degrees, tailored to circumstance. For some, a warning sufficed, a summons, a brief questioning, a reminder that they were being watched. For others, exile or imprisonment, and for many, execution. Each act reinforced the same lesson. The state did not forget. The Gestapo's network extended into every sphere of life. Factory managers submitted reports on workers' behavior. Postmen noted suspicious mail. Priests were monitored for unapproved sermons. Every fragment of information, no matter how trivial, flowed upward through layers of bureaucracy until it reached the polished desks in Berlin. This flow of data gave the illusion that the regime knew everything that it could see through walls and read thoughts. In truth, the machinery was inefficient, overwhelmed by its own volume. But illusion mattered more than accuracy. The perception of omniscience was itself a weapon. To maintain this illusion, propaganda depicted the Gestapo as a vast, all-seeing force. Posters showed the shadow of a man looming over a city, eyes glowing from darkness. Children's textbooks told stories of heroes who reported traitors to save the Reich. Cinema newsreels praised the quiet guardians of order. It was a paradox, an organization that thrived on secrecy yet demanded to be feared publicly. Inside the machinery, officers competed for recognition. Arrests and confessions were tallied like quotas. Efficiency was measured in bodies. Ambitious men learned that cruelty was rewarded. Those who hesitated were labeled weak. The system encouraged its servants to abandon conscience for advancement. And so the machinery fed on itself, turning ordinary men into instruments of dread. Some resisted quietly, even within. A few clerks misplaced files, delayed signatures, or warned acquaintances before arrests. Their courage was small and fragile, but real. They operated like faint pulses of humanity within a monstrous heart. Most were eventually discovered. Others lived with the unbearable contradiction of surviving by cooperating with evil. Outside, the public saw only the results, the sudden disappearances, the unexplained funerals, the locked doors. Mothers who went to the police to ask about their missing sons found themselves questioned in return. Wives who inquired about imprisoned husbands were told to consider their loyalty. Fear was recursive. It punished even curiosity. One survivor later described the experience of being arrested as falling out of time. Days and nights blurred into one another under the fluorescent light of the cell. No one told you what you had done, or how long you would remain. Interrogators came and went like ghosts, alternating kindness and cruelty, confusing mercy with menace. When they finally released you, if they did, the world outside felt strange, unreal, and muffled. You had been processed through the machinery of fear, and something inside you had been reshaped. The Gestapo's archives reveal the scale of its obsession with documentation. Millions of reports stamped, numbered, annotated. Officers wrote about human lives as though describing weather patterns. One memo begins, "Subject expressed inadequate enthusiasm for the Führer during parade." Another simply reads, "Subject removed portrait of Hitler from living room wall." The consequences of such observations could range from interrogation to execution. Every trivial act was elevated into a threat. The machinery was efficient not because it was flawless, but because it was self-correcting. Fear filled the gaps where logic failed. When files were missing, rumors sufficed. When evidence was thin, imagination supplied it. In this way, the system never stalled, it simply adapted. Its survival depended less on precision than on momentum, a continuous hum of dread that no one dared interrupt. And yet, beneath the hum, exhaustion spread. By 1943, even loyal Germans began to feel the weight of constant vigilance. The war brought hunger, bombings, loss. The machinery could no longer mask the decay around it. Officers grew anxious, desperate to prove relevance as the front collapsed. Arrests increased, brutality intensified. In trying to preserve control, the Gestapo accelerated its own unraveling. In the end, the machinery of fear devoured its own engineers. Files were burned to hide evidence. Officers turned on one another, denouncing colleagues to secure their own survival. The hum grew frantic, chaotic, until it stopped altogether. When the Allies arrived, they found the remnants of the system scattered like ashes across Europe. Piles of documents, broken locks, half-destroyed cells. The machinery had collapsed, but its echo lingered in every silence left behind. Those who studied its remains after the war understood something chilling. The Gestapo's strength had never been its numbers, nor its weapons, but its ability to turn fear into routine. It had shown how bureaucracy could murder efficiently, how obedience could replace morality, and how the ordinary could become monstrous through repetition. It was not madness that built the Gestapo's world, it was order, and that, perhaps, was the greatest horror of all. For it meant that the machinery of fear was not unique to one time or place. It could be built anywhere, from paper, from power, from silence. Its components were human, its energy emotional, and once it begins to hum, it sounds deceptively familiar, like progress, like discipline, like security. History remembers the Gestapo as the dark face of tyranny, but its machinery still whispers a warning through the corridors of time, that when fear is made efficient, humanity becomes expendable, that the cost of order, if left unchecked, is always the soul. The web of informant's fear rarely needs to shout. In a society tuned to its frequency, a whisper is enough. Long before the Gestapo perfected its chambers of torture and its libraries of files, it discovered a far more subtle and enduring instrument of control: people themselves. The secret police did not have the numbers to watch every street, every family, every factory. They did not need them. Their greatest triumph was persuading ordinary Germans to become the eyes and ears of terror, to transform private life into a network of suspicion so finely woven that it could catch even the smallest act of thought. It began with patriotism. Propaganda portrayed denunciation as an act of courage, an offering to the fatherland. Posters praised citizens who had exposed defeatists or Jews in hiding. Newspapers printed stories of workers who had reported their disloyal supervisors and saved their factories from sabotage. In classrooms, teachers instructed children that loyalty meant vigilance, that those who loved Germany must help cleanse it of traitors. At first, it sounded like duty. Soon, it became instinct. Conversations grew quieter, laughter more measured, and glances longer. What had once been neighborhood gossip now carried the weight of life and death. The machinery of denunciation ran on jealousy and fear as much as ideology. A quarrel over a promotion, a dispute about property, a rivalry between lovers, any resentment could be weaponized. A single sentence written to the Gestapo could destroy a life. A woman angered by her husband's affair might accuse him of listening to foreign radio. A tenant tired of his landlord could allege sympathy for the Jews. The Gestapo received thousands of such letters every week, most anonymous, some trembling with righteous outrage, others with venom thinly disguised as civic concern. Clerks read them, classified them, and decided which were worth pursuing. Even the flimsiest accusation could lead to interrogation. For the accused, proof of innocence meant little. To be named was to be guilty until proven irrelevant. Inside the Gestapo offices, denunciations piled higher than evidence. Most investigations began not from state surveillance, but from these voluntary betrayals. The organization thrived on the labor of its victims' neighbors. In Berlin, one officer might be responsible for monitoring tens of thousands of people, yet he could rely on hundreds willing to speak for him. It was not omniscience that made the Gestapo formidable, but delegation. They had outsourced terror to society itself. The more citizens feared one another, the less the state had to act. Fear became decentralized, efficient, self-propagating. There were those who believed that silence was safety, but silence too could be suspicious. To avoid gossip, people avoided emotion. Enthusiasm for the regime was performed with careful exaggeration, while private doubts were buried behind rehearsed smiles. In factories, workers sang patriotic songs with mechanical cheer. In churches, sermons praised loyalty. Families taught children never to repeat what they heard at home. A careless remark could travel through several mouths before landing on a Gestapo desk. Each home became both sanctuary and trap. The walls themselves seemed to listen. For many, the decision to denounce was not born of hatred, but of fear. When a friend spoke too freely, the listener felt cornered, compelled to choose between silence, which could later be deemed complicity, and betrayal, which at least offered the illusion of safety. The Gestapo never needed to demand loyalty outright. It simply made disloyalty fatal. Thus, moral calculation twisted into survival instinct. To protect oneself, one reported another. In this arithmetic, conscience was the first casualty. In the towns and villages, the pattern repeated endlessly. Farmers denounced neighbors for hoarding grain. Parishioners whispered about priests who hesitated to bless the Führer. Students informed on teachers who skipped Nazi salutes. Each act of betrayal was small, but together they created a dense fog of uncertainty that blanketed the country. Under that fog, rebellion suffocated. The Gestapo's genius lay not in its cruelty, but in its invisibility. People feared what they could not see, and in their fear, they saw it everywhere. There were letters that betrayed love as much as ideology. A woman in Munich, after discovering her husband's affair, accused his mistress of making defeatist remarks. The mistress was interrogated for hours before being sent to a camp. The husband, broken by guilt and fear, enlisted in a desperate attempt to prove loyalty and died within months on the Eastern Front. The Gestapo never intended to destroy marriages, yet it destroyed thousands, each betrayal a chain reaction of ruin. In its shadow, human emotion, love, envy, grief, all became raw material for control. Inside the Gestapo's archives, these denunciations were preserved with bureaucratic precision. Every letter was filed, every name indexed, every accusation stamped with dates and signatures. A historian leafing through them decades later could still sense the tremor of the writer's hand. Some letters were crudely written, scrawled in pencil by those who barely knew grammar. Others were eloquent, crafted by educated citizens who couched malice in civility. One began, "I hesitate to trouble your office, but as a loyal German, I feel it my duty to report." The sentences that followed led to 3 arrests and 2 deaths. Words, carefully chosen, had become instruments of execution. Among those who lived under this web, trust collapsed. Old friends crossed the street to avoid one another. Families divided silently, some members loyal to the regime, others terrified of them. In apartment buildings, curtains were drawn even during the day. The sight of a Gestapo car parked outside could send entire floors into panic. People no longer greeted postmen or shopkeepers with warmth. Every exchange carried the tension of performance. To live under the Gestapo was to act continuously, to measure every word, every gesture, every silence. The theater of obedience replaced community with choreography. Still, there were moments of quiet defiance. Some refused to denounce, no matter the risk. A teacher who burned his students' anonymous reports instead of forwarding them. A secretary who shredded denunciation letters before they reached her superiors. A mother who sheltered a neighbor's child after his parents were taken. These acts rarely changed the system, but they preserved something more precious: fragments of humanity in an inhuman age. The Gestapo's strength lay in making people forget that compassion could be resistance. Those who remembered paid dearly, but their courage endured. As the war progressed and Germany's fortunes waned, denunciations grew even more fevered. Bombings, hunger, and desperation sharpened paranoia. With defeat looming, suspicion became an outlet for rage. Citizens accused others of sabotage, defeatism, or spreading rumors about Allied victories. Many accusations came not from conviction, but from despair, an attempt to make sense of chaos by blaming someone near. The web tightened, but it also began to fray. Too many names, too many lies, too little time to verify them all. The machinery of fear was overloading on its own creations. When the Gestapo collapsed in 1945, Allied investigators were astonished by what they found. The files showed that most cases originated not from elaborate espionage, but from the public. The myth of the all-seeing secret police disintegrated into something far more disturbing, the image of an entire society complicit in its own oppression. In the ruins of cities, people claimed ignorance, swearing they had never known the scale of terror. Yet, the archives told another story. Written in familiar handwriting, the Gestapo had not needed to watch everyone. People had done the gest, watching for them. In the years that followed, historians would struggle with the same haunting question. How could so many have participated? The answer, perhaps, lies in the fragile alchemy between fear and belonging. Under totalitarian rule, survival becomes communal. One survives by blending in, by mirroring others, by performing loyalty until it feels indistinguishable from faith. Denunciation becomes a language of conformity, a signal to the state that one belongs. The tragedy of the Gestapo's web was not merely its cruelty, but its familiarity. It was built not by monsters, but by neighbors. Those who later spoke of those years often described a strange silence that lingered after the war, as if the echoes of whispers could not be silenced even by liberation. Some could not forgive themselves for what they had written. Others still justified it as necessity. The victims were gone, but the fear remained, diffused into the ordinary rhythms of post-war life. It is perhaps the final victory of the web that long after it was dismantled, it continued to live in memory, shaping the way people trusted, spoke, and remembered. The story of the Gestapo's informants is the story of fear made intimate. It teaches that tyranny does not thrive on cruelty alone, but on cooperation, that the distance between safety and complicity can be measured in a single sentence. Within that web, the Gestapo discovered the darkest truth of all, that the most powerful prison is not built of walls or guards, but of the suspicion that lives between people. And once that suspicion takes root, even love learns to whisper. The face of terror, in the Gestapo's world, did not hide behind masks. It wore a uniform. The black coat, the polished boots, the insignia on the collar. These were not just symbols of rank, but instruments of theater. The men who enforced the will of the Reich understood the power of appearance. They moved through cities like living emblems of authority, their very presence enough to still conversations and drain color from faces. The sight of one officer at a doorway could make time itself seem to freeze. For the Gestapo, fear was not merely an emotion to exploit, it was an art to perform. Officers learned how to enter a room, how to speak softly, and yet leave no doubt of consequence, how to pause before delivering a question, so that silence itself became interrogation. Their cruelty was deliberate, never chaotic. They understood that predictability weakens fear, so they mastered unpredictability. One day a kind gesture, the next a blow. It was not the pain that broke their victims, but the uncertainty. Every encounter with the Gestapo was a descent into guessing what would happen next, and that guessing consumed the soul. Behind their sharp uniforms, however, these men were not omnipotent monsters. Many were bureaucrats with modest origins, clerks, failed students, or policemen, seeking purpose in chaos. The Nazi regime offered them not just employment, but identity. Within the Gestapo, mediocrity could be dressed as power. The uniform erased doubt, replaced insecurity with certainty, and turned obedience into pride. The transformation was intoxicating. It is one of history's quiet horrors, how ordinary men, unremarkable in intellect or morality, became engines of fear through the simple seduction of authority. Each officer carried two faces, one for the world outside, and one for the dimly lit rooms where power became cruelty. To their families, they were fathers, husbands, neighbors who read newspapers at breakfast. But once they crossed the threshold of their offices, they stepped into a role that blurred morality into procedure. The system encouraged this split. Duty became the language of denial. A man could inflict agony at noon and eat supper with his children at 6, believing he had done nothing wrong because his uniform said so. Those who resisted the pull of this transformation found themselves isolated or reassigned. Compassion was a liability. The Gestapo's culture rewarded those who acted decisively, who showed no hesitation. To question an order was to reveal weakness, and weakness was contagion. Many officers learned to suppress their unease, to replace conscience with efficiency. They began to think in forms and signatures, in codes and numbers. Humanity was abstracted, and once abstracted, it was easy to destroy. The victims saw the other side of this abstraction. To them, the Gestapo officer was faceless, a shadow with a pen and a pistol. Survivors spoke of voices more than faces. Calm, almost polite voices asking questions that could end in screams. The interrogations were structured to dismantle not just resistance, but identity. The accused were stripped of name and context, reduced to categories: traitor, saboteur, undesirable. Once a human being became a label, empathy vanished. The machinery of fear needed only labels to function. In many interrogation rooms, officers prided themselves on precision. They recorded every confession, every denial, every plea. The walls echoed with methodical cruelty. Some interrogators toyed with their prisoners, offering cigarettes or soft words between blows, crafting confusion until gratitude itself became punishment. There was no rhythm to the pain, only its persistence. Those who survived later described the horror of waiting the seconds before the next strike, the pause before another question, the faint click of a lighter before another hour of silence. The Gestapo had learned that fear's sharpest edge lies not in violence itself, but in the moment before it arrives. Outside those walls, civilians saw the aftershocks. A man taken for questioning might return days later, pale and hollow, his silence heavier than any confession. Neighbors avoided his eyes. His presence was a reminder of what could not be spoken. The Gestapo did not need to publicize its methods, its victims did that for them. The bruises, the tremors, the empty stares became their propaganda. Every broken survivor was a warning written in flesh. And yet, beneath this empire of dread, there were cracks. Some officers, haunted by what they had done, began to falter. A few sought transfers to frontline units, preferring the clarity of battle to the murk of interrogation. Others drowned guilt in alcohol, numbing themselves against memory. The Gestapo tolerated such weaknesses as long as discipline was maintained, but behind the rigid facade, the rot was spreading. Power had corrupted, but fear had consumed its own masters. To maintain control, they too had to believe in their own myth of necessity. They told themselves they were defending the Reich, that their cruelty was duty, not choice. It was a convenient lie, and they clung to it with desperate conviction. As the war turned against Germany, this conviction grew frantic. Bombs fell on cities, families fled the ruins, and yet the Gestapo clung to its rituals, the paperwork, the interrogations, the arrests. It was as if procedure itself could hold back defeat. In truth, they were no longer defending a nation but preserving the illusion of control. Every execution, every raid, became an act of denial against the crumbling world outside. Their faces, once masks of authority, now revealed something closer to madness. The madness of men who cannot admit they have lost. But terror, once unleashed, does not end with the men who create it. The fear they spread seeped into the walls, into the air, into the collective memory of those who lived under them. Long after the Gestapo's uniforms vanished from the streets, people still dreamed of their knocks at the door, still hesitated before speaking their minds, still flinched at footsteps in the night. The face of terror, it turned out, was not only a man in a coat, it was the reflection of fear that lingered in those who survived him. History often tries to separate monsters from men, but the Gestapo reminds us that the boundary is paper thin. Evil does not arrive with horns and fire. It arrives in uniform, holding a clipboard, asking for cooperation. It smiles, it takes notes, It promises safety, and in the next breath, it destroys. The face of terror is polite, organized, and utterly certain of its righteousness. That is why it endures. And yet, even in that certainty, even in those quiet hallways of cruelty, there were moments when the facade trembled, when an officer hesitated before signing a name, when a prisoner refused to beg, when silence became resistance. These moments did not undo the horror, but they reminded the world that fear, no matter how vast, can never be absolute. The Gestapo ruled by terror, but terror, in its essence, is fragile. It needs belief to survive. When the Reich finally fell, the faces that had once commanded obedience were suddenly unmasked. Some fled into the night, others blended into crowds. The uniform that once protected them became a liability. Stripped of their symbols, they looked ordinary again, men whose power had existed only in the fear of others. It was a revelation too cruel to comfort. The face of terror, once so commanding, was merely human after all. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying truth of all. Collapse of the Shadow Empire. By the winter of 1944, the illusion of invincibility that had cloaked the Gestapo began to unravel. The empire they had built, an empire of whispers, files, and fear, was collapsing beneath the weight of its own cruelty. The Reich that had once promised 1,000 years of glory was disintegrating in months. Cities lay in ruins, their streets silent except for the echo of boots and the distant rumble of bombs. Yet within those ruins, the Gestapo clung desperately to its fading authority, as if the terror they had spread could hold back defeat. In Berlin, the heart of their power, the once orderly, offices were filled with chaos. Files piled high on desks. Phones rang without answer, and orders came faster than anyone could obey. Officers who had once carried themselves with measured calm now moved with a nervous haste, aware that the tide was turning. The Allied armies were closing in, and the walls of their shadow empire were crumbling. But the Gestapo had never been trained to surrender. Their instinct, honed over years of repression, was to tighten their grip. Fear had built their power, and fear became their last refuge. As bombs fell, they arrested anyone who whispered of defeat. As cities burned, they hunted deserters and defeatists. Posters appeared overnight, warning that cowards will hang. The people, already starving and exhausted, found themselves trapped between two terrors, the enemy advancing from without, and the Gestapo devouring from within. To survive, they said nothing, looked down, and waited for the end. Across the shattered Reich, the Gestapo's reach became both desperate and erratic. In small towns, local offices took brutal liberties, executing suspected deserters in public squares. In the countryside, their patrols hunted refugees, accusing them of espionage or sabotage. Entire families disappeared in the final months, swallowed by the machinery of repression that no longer served a purpose. The Gestapo was no longer enforcing order, it was feeding on chaos. The system that had prided itself on precision had descended into frenzy. Inside their interrogation rooms, the same methods continued. The questions, the blows, the calculated silences. But something had changed. The officers no longer believed in victory. They believed only in survival. Some interrogations became acts of vented rage, others acts of habit. The bureaucracy of cruelty ran on inertia, unable to stop even as its foundations collapsed. Files were still written, reports still stamped, as though paper could preserve a dying empire. It was the purest expression of their madness, the faith that documentation could outlast reality. Meanwhile, the outside world was closing in. Allied aircraft blackened the skies over the Reich, and the Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east. Cities that had been strongholds of authority, Cologne, Hamburg, Munich, fell one after another. Each fall revealed hidden prisons, mass graves, and shattered documents that told stories the regime could no longer silence. The Gestapo's secrets, once buried in locked cabinets, were scattered across ruins for the world to see. But even as defeat became undeniable, many officers refused to abandon their duties. They hunted until the very end. In the ruins of Berlin, Gestapo patrols executed civilians accused of spreading defeatist rumors. Others dragged prisoners from cells only to shoot them in basements before fleeing themselves. Loyalty, once demanded of others, had become an excuse for murder. The Gestapo had always claimed to defend the Reich. Now they were destroying what little remained of it. For ordinary Germans, the final months were a waking nightmare. Hunger gnawed at cities where food had vanished. Families huddled in cellars as artillery fire shook the walls. Yet even then, the knock on the door could still come the same knock that had haunted them for years. To speak of surrender, to question Hitler, to weep for the dead, any of these could bring arrest. The Gestapo's war against its own people continued even as the real war was lost. The empire of fear was dying, but it refused to die quietly. When the Allies finally entered Germany in the spring of 1945, they found a landscape of silence and ruin. Gestapo offices were abandoned in haste, desks overturned, papers burning, cells left open. In some, the stench of death lingered. Prisoners too weak to move lay among corpses. In others, officers had taken their own lives, unwilling to face capture. The empire of terror had devoured itself, leaving behind only ashes and records, endless records, each page a monument to suffering. In the weeks that followed, survivors began to emerge from the shadows. Emaciated, trembling, their eyes hollow but alive. They spoke of rooms without light, of endless interrogations, of the sound of boots outside the door. Their voices, weak but steady, gave form to the nightmare the world had only guessed at. The Gestapo's hidden empire had been built on secrecy. Now, its own meticulous files became the evidence of its crimes. The paper trail of terror had turned into a confession. The Allies were stunned by what they found. Soldiers who had fought through blood and fire admitted that nothing on the battlefield had prepared them for what they discovered in those cellars. Torture instruments, execution lists, the graffiti of prisoners scratched into concrete walls, pleas for mercy, names of loved ones, final prayers. The myths of German ignorance dissolved under the weight of that evidence. The Gestapo's crimes had not been distant or invisible. They had been next door, written in ink and blood. As arrests began, the once feared officers tried to disappear into the flood of refugees. Some traded uniforms for rags, others destroyed their papers and fled. But the mark of the Gestapo was hard to erase. Their colleagues betrayed them, survivors identified them, and their own records sealed their fate. Interrogations of captured officers revealed a chilling sameness, the same excuses, the same words, "I was following orders." Yet, beneath the practiced denials lay something more haunting. The emptiness of men who had built their identity on fear and found it gone. In the aftermath, the question that haunted both victors and survivors was not only how such a system had existed, but why so many had served it so willingly. The answer, as historians would later write, lay in the Gestapo's true genius. It had not needed armies to enforce its power, only belief. It made people afraid of each other, afraid of themselves. The empire it built was psychological as much as physical, a world where silence was safety and obedience was survival. When that empire finally collapsed, it left no monuments, no victories, no songs, only scars. The Gestapo's offices became museums of horror, their records archives of guilt. The silence they had imposed for 12 years was broken by testimony, by the slow and painful act of remembering. Yet the echoes of their methods, the surveillance, the propaganda, the weaponization of fear, lingered like smoke long after the flames were gone. The shadow empire had fallen, but its lessons remained. It taught the world that evil does not always march in armies, or speak in shouts. Sometimes it files reports, stamps papers, and calls itself duty. The collapse of the Gestapo was not just the end of a regime, it was the unmasking of fear itself. For in those final days, when their prison stood open and their power dissolved into rubble, the truth became clear. Terror is not immortal. It survives only as long as people believe in it. And when belief is broken, even the darkest empire crumbles into dust. Reckoning. When the guns finally fell silent, the world was left with a silence far heavier than victory. Germany was a ruin, its cities bombed to dust, its people hollowed by hunger and grief. Yet, amid the rubble stood something far darker than broken stone. The memory of what had been done behind closed doors. The Gestapo, once the unseen power binding the Reich together, now lay exposed. Its offices, its files, its prisons, all the invisible instruments of its terror were suddenly visible to the world. And the reckoning had begun. In the first days after liberation, Allied soldiers moved through the remnants of Gestapo, buildings with disbelief. They found rooms still smelling of fear, walls engraved by desperate hands, and drawers stuffed with documents written in precise, chilling language. The bureaucracy of terror had left behind an almost perfect record of its crimes. Each typed report, each stamped page, each signed confession told the story of a life destroyed by procedure. It was not chaos that had governed the Gestapo, it was order, meticulous and merciless. The Allies began collecting this evidence, photographing everything they found. British and American officers walked through torture chambers with cameras instead of guns. Soviet soldiers uncovered mass graves and displayed the files that ordered them. Newspapers published photographs of these discoveries, and the world stared in horror. People who had heard rumors, who had guessed at the truth but never dared to speak it, now saw the proof printed on paper. The Gestapo's myth of secrecy was gone. What it left behind was not mystery, but monstrous clarity. In towns and cities across Germany, ordinary citizens were forced to confront what had been done in their name. In some places, Allied officers marched townspeople through Gestapo prisons, making them look at the cells, the instruments, the corpses left behind. Men and women wept, denied, or stood silent. Many said they had not known. But silence had been the Gestapo's greatest ally. Now that silence was being shattered, not by defiance, but by the undeniable evidence of what fear had protected. Trials began quickly, though justice moved unevenly. In some places, enraged locals executed Gestapo officers without waiting for judgment. In others, formal tribunals assembled to investigate. Prisoners who had survived were brought forward as witnesses. They stood trembling in courtrooms, their thin voices recounting horrors that seemed almost impossible. Yet every word was echoed in the documents found in those abandoned offices. Torture orders, arrest lists, deportation records, all written with the precision of accountants, all proving that cruelty had been deliberate, planned, and systematic. For the first time in history, the Blästring Underwehr world faced the question of whether an organization itself, not just its members, could be declared criminal. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg made the decision that would define modern justice. The Gestapo, it declared, was not merely an instrument of state power. It was a criminal organization, guilty of crimes against humanity. Its very existence had been an act of war against the innocent. The verdict was sweeping and symbolic. It meant that every man who had served within the Gestapo bore the shadow of guilt. But in practice, justice could not reach them all. Thousands of officers fled into the post-war chaos, changing names, blending into crowds of refugees. Others were captured by the Soviets and vanished into camps. Some were tried, sentenced, and executed. Yet many more slipped through the cracks, protected by circumstance, by silence, or by the shifting priorities of a world now consumed by the Cold War. Still, for those who faced judgment, the reckoning was unrelenting. In courtrooms, They stood before their victims and claimed obedience as their defense. "We followed orders," they said. "We were loyal to our duty." But the world had seen what that duty meant. Judges and prosecutors read aloud the words written in Gestapo. Reports interrogation completed. Prisoner deceased. Special treatment administered. Transport executed. And the banality of the language became a greater indictment than any confession. These men had not acted in chaos or madness. They had acted in perfect order, in deliberate, bureaucratic cruelty. The trials also revealed something more profound than guilt. They exposed how ordinary people had become instruments of terror. Clerks who filed arrest warrants, typists who recorded confessions, drivers who transported prisoners, all were part of the machine. Few had fired a gun or wielded a whip, yet without them, the machinery would not have worked. The Gestapo's legacy was not only in the cruelty of its officers, but in the compliance of thousands who believed that duty absolved them of conscience. Outside the courts, the German people began a slow and painful confrontation with their past. Many wanted to forget, to bury the shame along with the ruins. But survivors refused to let the world look away. They gave testimony to journalists, historians, and teachers. They described the sound of footsteps in the hallways, the terror of being watched, the suffocating silence of a society where trust had died. Their stories transformed history from abstraction into human experience. The Gestapo was no longer just a name. It was a wound that had cut through families, neighborhoods, and the soul of a nation. In the years that followed, remembrance became its own form of justice. Former Gestapo buildings were turned into museums and memorials. The walls where prisoners had carved messages became exhibits. Visitors read their words simple, haunting sentences like, "I am innocent," or "Do not forget me." In these spaces, memory replaced fear. What had once been headquarters of silence became places of voices. The very rooms built for repression became shrines of truth. But justice, even then, was incomplete. Many perpetrators lived quietly for decades, their pasts unspoken, their names changed. It was only in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds that new generations began to demand answers. Trials reopened, historians unearthed hidden archives, and the story of the Gestapo was told again, not as myth, but as warning. Germans began to teach their children not only about the crimes of others, but about the danger of silence itself. For the survivors, the reckoning never truly ended. Some carried their scars in body and mind until the end of their lives, yet many found strength in testimony, in transforming pain into remembrance. Their courage ensured that the world would never again confuse obedience with morality. They proved that even after the darkest night, truth can still find its voice. And so, when history finally wrote the epitaph of the Gestapo, it was not written by the victors or the prosecutors, but by those who had survived it. They spoke not of vengeance, but of warning that tyranny begins not with violence, but with silence, not with monsters, but with men who forget compassion in the name of duty. The reckoning of the Gestapo was not only a judgment of the past, but a mirror held to the future. In the end, the empire of fear that had once ruled Europe left behind nothing but paper, ruins, and ghosts. Yet from those ghosts rose a simple truth. No regime built on terror can outlast the memory of its victims. Fear dies, memory endures, and in that endurance, justice, however imperfect, finds its form. Aftermath and silence. The war was over, but for many, peace did not arrive with liberation. It came slowly, quietly, wrapped in disbelief. The guns had fallen silent, yet the echoes of fear lingered in the walls, in the air, in the hearts of those who had lived under the shadow of the Gestapo. Germany lay in ruins, its cities reduced to gray dust and broken stone. its people staring at the wreckage of a world they had once believed unshakable. The banners had vanished, but the silence remained. It was a different silence now, not the enforced quiet of fear, but the heavy stillness of reckoning. For survivors, silence was both refuge and torment. Many who had endured the Gestapo's prisons found it impossible to speak of what they had seen. Their words caught in their throats, too fragile to bear the weight of memory. Others spoke endlessly, as if words could exorcise what had been done to them. But whether voiced or buried, the past refused to stay still. Families reunited, but trust did not. Neighbors met again, but behind every smile lingered the old question: who had spoken? Who had remained silent? The Gestapo's genius had been to make people fear one another, and even in defeat, that fear had not yet faded. In the new Germany that began to rise from the rubble, memory was a fragile thing. The victors had exposed the crimes, held trials, and declared the Gestapo a criminal organization. Yet in the homes of ordinary citizens, the subject was avoided. Fathers who had worn uniforms sat quietly at dinner tables, staring into their plates. Mothers whispered warnings to their children not to ask too many questions. For years, the word Gestapo was spoken only in half voices, as though the very syllables could still summon danger. Forgetting seemed easier than remembering. But memory has a way of returning slowly, insistently, like water finding cracks in stone. In the 1950 seconds, as West Germany rebuilt and East Germany hardened under Soviet rule, a new generation grew up amid silence. They did not understand the fear that had shaped their parents. They saw photographs, heard rumors, and began to ask questions. In time, those questions became demands. The silence that had once protected began to crumble. Historians opened archives. Survivors wrote memoirs. Journalists traced the lives of men who had quietly returned to civil service. And once more, the word Gestapo entered the public air not as an accusation whispered in fear, but as a name spoken with the calm, cold purpose of understanding. In towns and cities, remnants of Gestapo offices still stood grim, gray buildings with barred windows and basements that smelled of damp stone. For years, they had been ignored, repurposed, or demolished. But as the memory movement grew, survivors insisted that these places should not be erased. In Cologne, the old Gestapo headquarters became a memorial. In Berlin, the ruins of the SS and Gestapo complex were preserved and renamed Topography of Terror. Visitors walked through the remnants of cells where prisoners had waited for interrogations, reading the scratched names on the walls. Each carving, each line of handwriting, was a heartbeat pulled from history's silence. The very spaces that had once swallowed screams now spoke again, not in horror, but in remembrance. In East Germany, remembrance took a different form. The Soviet regime used the memory of Nazi terror as political weaponry, painting the Gestapo as the ultimate embodiment of capitalist evil. Monuments rose, trials continued, but the victims' stories were often twisted into propaganda. In the West, where rebuilding demanded reconciliation, the tone was quieter, more uncertain. Many former Gestapo men blended back into society, hidden among the thousands who claimed ignorance or obedience. The Cold War had drawn a new line of fear, and in its shadow, old crimes sometimes faded from view. But the archives waited. History has patience. By the 1960 seconds, the second generation, the children of the war, began to ask again. They challenged the old silences, confronted their parents, and demanded truth from a society that had tried to move on. Universities filled with debates about complicity and guilt. Films, books, and plays forced the public to look again at the machinery of repression. The Gestapo, once a name that evoked silence, became a subject of study, of reflection, of warning. Germany was learning that true peace could not exist without remembrance. For the survivors who were still alive, This renewed attention brought both relief and pain. Many returned to the sites where they had once been imprisoned. They touched the cold walls, stood in the empty corridors, and remembered the faces of those who never came back. Some guided visitors through the memorials, their trembling voices steady as they told their stories. They did not seek pity. They sought permanence, the assurance that memory would outlast them. In those moments, the past and the present seemed to meet. The city streets that now bustled with life stood over layers of unspoken history. Beneath the laughter of children and the hum of trams lay the ghosts of the old silence. But the ghosts no longer ruled. They were remembered. And remembrance, fragile as it was, became a quiet victory over fear. Outside Germany, the name Gestapo became a symbol, a warning that echoed across continents. In every debate about power and surveillance, the shadow of the Gestapo appeared. In the Cold War years, it was invoked in whispers about secret police from East Berlin to Moscow. Later, it appeared in classrooms and documentaries, a reminder of how swiftly order can turn to oppression. The Gestapo had perished, but its lessons lived on, not as a distant history, but as a mirror for every age. As decades passed, the survivors grew fewer, their voices softer. But their testimonies recorded, archived, preserved, ensured that the silence which once protected the Gestapo would never return. Museums displayed their stories alongside the documents of their tormentors. Scholars wrote of the machinery of fear, not to relive it, but to understand how easily it had been built and how easily it could be built again. The legacy of the Gestapo thus became more than history. It became a moral compass, a reminder of what happens when obedience replaces conscience, and when silence becomes safer than truth. In the stillness of memorial halls, under dim lights and heavy air, visitors stand before displays of names, photographs, and artifacts. Some cry, others cannot speak. A few simply close their eyes and listen not for words, but for echoes. They hear the quiet that once ruled a continent, and then they understand. The true aftermath of terror is not noise, but silence. A silence that lasts for generations, until courage dares to break it. And so, the story of the Gestapo does not end with its defeat, nor even with its trials. It ends in the persistence of memory, in the quiet insistence that what was once done in darkness must always be brought into light. The silence that follows tyranny is not peace. It is the beginning of remembrance. And remembrance, however painful, is the only way history learns to breathe again. Memory and meaning. In the years that followed the war, Germany and the world began to confront not only the ruins of cities, but the ruins of conscience. The Gestapo had disappeared as an institution, its files scattered, its officers either executed, imprisoned, or hidden among ordinary people. Yet its presence lingered not in uniforms or slogans, but in memory. The story of the Gestapo was no longer about raids, prisons, or torture chambers. It was about what remained when fear outlasted the regime that created it. At first, remembrance came in fragments, a diary found in the rubble, a survivor's testimony recorded in a trembling hand, a wall etched with a prisoner's final words. These traces spoke quietly, but they spoke with truth. As the world sought to rebuild, these memories were not always welcomed. For many Germans, the weight of collective guilt was unbearable. It was easier to point at the leaders who had fled or died than to look inward. For the Allies, rebuilding took precedence over reflection. The ruins had to be cleared, economies restored, and a new order forged before the ghosts could be faced. But ghosts have patience. Memory waits until the world is ready to listen. By the 1,950 historians began to collect what remained of the Gestapo's archives. Millions of pages, covered in stamps, signatures, and cold bureaucratic language, revealed the machinery of obedience. There were orders for deportations, lists of names, and interrogation reports. The handwriting of ordinary men filled the margins, men who had believed themselves simply doing their jobs. It was here that the world began to understand one of the Gestapo's most terrifying truths. Evil need not be monstrous. It can be methodical, quiet, even polite. The cruelty of the Gestapo had not depended on madness or chaos, but on discipline and paperwork. This realization unsettled those who read the documents, for it meant that such things were not confined to one time or nation. They were possible wherever conscience was replaced by procedure. In classrooms across Germany, teachers struggled to explain this legacy to children who could not imagine what it meant to live under such terror. The young listened, wide-eyed, as they learned how suspicion had become law and how neighbors had denounced each other. Some asked their parents questions that went unanswered. Others grew angry, unable to reconcile love for their families with the knowledge of complicity. Germany's recovery was not only physical, it was moral. The nation had to rebuild its soul. Facing the memory of the Gestapo became an act of collective therapy, one that demanded honesty more painful than any punishment. Meanwhile, across Europe, memorials began to rise on the sites where Gestapo prisons once stood. In Vienna, a small museum opened inside the old interrogation headquarters, where visitors could still see the scratched messages on cell walls. In Paris, at 84 Avenue Foch, plaques commemorated those tortured or killed. In Warsaw, the ruins of the Pawiak prison stood as both warning and remembrance. Each site carried a silence that spoke louder than words. It was not a silence of fear, but of respect, a space for grief to breathe. By the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, filmmakers, writers, and artists began to reimagine the Gestapo not as an abstract evil, but as a human story, the story of choices made, of silence kept, of courage found too late. These depictions forced audiences to confront uncomfortable truths. The Gestapo's horror was not only in its violence, but in its familiarity. It had lived among ordinary people, worked in their neighborhoods, and depended on their compliance. The memory of it was a mirror, showing not monsters, but reflections. And that, perhaps, was its most haunting legacy. As survivors aged, their testimonies became sacred. They spoke to students, journalists, and scholars, repeating their stories again and again, as if repetition could keep memory alive. They described the small sounds that stayed with them, the footsteps in corridors, the click of a typewriter, the turning of a key. Each detail became a fragment of the past, preserved against forgetting. They spoke not for revenge, but for remembrance. Many ended their testimonies with a plea, "Tell it forward," for they understood that memory was the final defense against repetition. In modern Germany, the study of the Gestapo became part of a national promise to remember not only the victims, but the system that made victims possible. Streets were renamed after those who resisted. Stolperstein, or stumbling stones, were laid in sidewalks, small brass plaques engraved with names and dates, marking the last known homes of the deported. Passers-by would see them glinting in the sunlight, bending down to read, and for a moment, the present would meet the past. Every name, every year, every address became a reminder that history lived not in books, but beneath our feet. Beyond Germany, the lessons of the Gestapo rippled outward. Scholars of politics, law, and ethics studied how ordinary institutions could become instruments of terror. Police academies around the world taught the story as a warning that authority without accountability leads inevitably to abuse. Human rights organizations cited the Gestapo in arguments for international law, for oversight, for transparency. The shadow of the Gestapo had become a moral compass, pointing not to vengeance, but vigilance. And yet, even as memory was institutionalized, something fragile remained: the question of how people could live, knowing what had been done. Some chose denial, others despair, but many found meaning in remembrance. The act of remembering became a kind of resistance, proof that the Gestapo had failed to erase humanity. Where once their files had recorded obedience, now memorials recorded defiance. Where once their cells had swallowed screams, now visitors walked freely through the same halls. Memory had turned the architecture of fear into a monument of truth. For the descendants of both victims and perpetrators, memory became inheritance. Some carried pride in survival, others carried shame for silence. Yet together, they built a language of reckoning. They wrote books, made documentaries, and held public ceremonies not to reopen wounds, but to keep them from closing too easily. They understood that peace without memory is fragile, that forgetting is the first step toward repetition. The Gestapo's story thus became not only a German memory, but a human one, a lesson written in every place where fear has tried to rule. And so, as the decades turned and the century faded, the name Gestapo ceased to belong only to the past. It became a word of warning, whispered whenever power grew unchecked, whenever surveillance crept too far, whenever silence seemed safer than truth. The memory of it lived on not in darkness, but in light, as a guide through history's shadows. The story did not end with destruction. It ended with awareness. In every classroom, every museum, every quiet moment of reflection, the ghosts of the Gestapo find new voices. They do not speak of terror anymore, but of endurance, of how memory, fragile though it may be, can outlast fear. And perhaps that is the final triumph over tyranny, that the world continues to remember, to teach, to feel. For as long as memory survives, the silence that once empowered the Gestapo can never again take hold. The reckoning of history. When the war ended, justice was not a single moment. It came in waves, uncertain, uneven, and slow, like the tide reclaiming a scarred shore. The Gestapo, once the invisible hand of terror, now stood exposed beneath the light of victory. The Allies entered abandoned offices and found what the victims had always known: the paperwork of fear. Files, photographs, coded reports, and interrogation summaries lay scattered across floors like fallen leaves. The machinery of repression, once hidden in secrecy, now lay silent but intact. The evidence spoke with chilling clarity. In those first months after liberation, investigators moved cautiously through the ruins. They found cells still warm with the trace of human suffering, the faint smell of damp walls, the carved names of the dead, the whispers of what had been done. Soldiers accustomed to the noise of battle grew silent as they uncovered the instruments of torture, the registers of deportations, the methodical precision of cruelty recorded in neat handwriting. It was here, amid the rubble and the silence, that the reckoning began. Trials emerged first from outrage, then from necessity. The world needed to understand how such a system could exist, how law could be weaponized against the innocent. The Nuremberg Tribunal became the stage upon which the Gestapo was named, not merely as a tool of evil, but as a criminal organization in its entirety. Prosecutors presented evidence drawn from the captured archives, orders for executions, transport lists, and the cold language of official reports describing atrocities as special treatment. Survivors testified, their words trembling but precise, describing the beatings, the fear, the hopelessness of those who vanished behind Gestapo doors. The tribunal's judges, hardened men who had seen the worst of war, were visibly shaken. They realized that the Gestapo's crime was not chaos, but order, the order of forms, stamps, and signatures. The horror lay not in madness, but in method. It was the crime of civilization turned inward, bureaucracy used to destroy rather than protect. When the verdict came, it declared what the world already sensed, that no one who served the Gestapo could claim innocence. The institution itself was a crime, yet justice proved fragile. The scale of the Gestapo's reach made perfect accountability impossible. Thousands of officers had fled or disguised themselves, blending into the tide of refugees, that swept across ruined Germany. Others fell into Soviet hands, vanishing into gulags or facing swift retribution in the East. In the West, where the task of rebuilding took precedence, denazification faltered under the sheer weight of numbers. Millions were screamed. Few were punished. Former Gestapo men slipped into anonymity, taking jobs as clerks, policemen, or businessmen in the new republic. The shadow of their past lingered, but the world moved forward, eager to bury the darkness beneath the promise of recovery. Still, the reckoning did not end at Nuremberg. Smaller trials unfolded in the following years in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Poland. Local collaborators were brought before hastily assembled courts, their roles examined under the fury of the liberated. Some were executed, others imprisoned, a few pardoned in the name of reconciliation. Each trial was a fragment of justice, incomplete but necessary. The world was learning that punishing a system was easier than punishing those who had lived inside it. For survivors, justice could never be enough. They watched the proceedings with a mixture of relief and bitterness. They saw men who had once held absolute power, now standing in the dock, stripped of authority, forced to listen to the testimonies of those they had tried to erase. Yet many others escaped entirely, their crimes lost amid the chaos of post-war Europe. Justice was partial, imperfect, but it was something. It gave shape to grief and offered a language to describe what had been endured. Over time, the reckoning shifted from the courts to the conscience of nations. Historians began to ask deeper questions. How could ordinary men become torturers? How could a society so advanced in science and art create a police force so dedicated to destruction? The answers did not come easily. Some pointed to ideology, others to fear, others still to ambition and obedience. The Gestapo became a mirror in which humanity saw its reflection not as monsters, but as people capable of monstrous choices. In this way, the reckoning continued long after the last trials ended. Germany, divided between East and West, confronted its past along different paths. In the East, remembrance was imposed by the state, a weapon of propaganda against capitalism. In the West, remembrance grew from the bottom up, through memoirs, art, and education. Slowly, the word Gestapo lost its immediacy of terror and became a symbol, a warning whispered across generations. By the 1960 seconds and 70 seconds, a new reckoning emerged, not legal, but moral. Children of former Gestapo members discovered who their fathers had been. Some rejected them, others sought understanding. Filmmakers began to recreate interrogations and arrests in haunting realism, forcing audiences to confront what had been easier to forget. Scholars uncovered more archives, revealing just how ordinary the machinery of death had been. The narrative of just following orders began to crumble. The world saw the Gestapo not as a handful of zealots, but as a vast network of compliance and silence, a system sustained by everyday people who looked away. As the decades passed, justice took on a new form: remembrance itself. The true reckoning was not only in trials or sentences, but in memory that refused to fade. Monuments rose where cells once stood. Exhibitions displayed documents alongside testimonies, showing both the faceless bureaucracy and the human pain it concealed. School children walked through memorial sites, where the walls still bore the etchings of the condemned. The names that once appeared in cold reports now lived again, spoken aloud in ceremonies of remembrance. The reckoning of history, like justice itself, was never absolute. It did not erase what had been done, but it ensured that the Gestapo's crimes could never again be hidden behind the mask of obedience or necessity. In every preserved document, every testimony, and every quiet visit to a memorial, the world continued to confront the same question: how fear, law, and loyalty could fuse into horror. The answer remains uncomfortable, because it lies not in the Gestapo alone, but in the human capacity for surrendering conscience. And so the reckoning endures in classrooms where students read survivors' words, in films that replay the silence of interrogation rooms, in museums where the light falls softly across names once erased. The Gestapo's power died in 1945, but its warning did not. It whispers still, reminding the living that tyranny does not vanish. It waits, it watches, it learns. The true reckoning of history, then, is not merely to remember what was done, but to remain vigilant against what could be done again. In this enduring reflection, the story of the Gestapo transforms from tragedy into testimony, proof that even in the darkest systems, truth will surface and memory will demand to be heard. Justice may fade, but remembrance remains. And remembrance, at last, is what redeems the silence. Echoes of Silence history does not bury its ghosts. It lets them wander, softly, through the corridors of memory. Unseen but not unfelt, the Gestapo, once a name spoken only in fear, became one of those ghosts drifting through archives, whispered in classrooms, remembered in the quiet steps of visitors who walk where prisoners once stood. Their buildings are gone, their flags burned, their power dissolved. Yet something of them remains, a reminder that the machinery of fear never truly dies. It waits for silence to invite it back. In the ruins of post-war Germany, as cities rose again from dust and ash, people learned to live beside these ghosts. Streets once patrolled by secret police became ordinary once more, filled with laughter, markets, and the hum of normal life. But beneath the pavements, beneath the facades of new apartments and offices, were the buried rooms where the walls had listened. The past was always just beneath the surface, not gone, only hidden. The reckoning of history had revealed the truth, but remembrance had only begun. The first museums appeared quietly, a basement preserved here, a plaque placed there. In Cologne, the ELDE house, once Gestapo headquarters, became a memorial. Its cells were left untouched, the scratched names, the crude calendars, the messages carved by doomed hands. In Berlin, the Topography of Terror Museum rose from the foundations of the old Gestapo and SS headquarters. Visitors walked over the same earth, where commands of repression were once signed. The silence inside those walls carried more weight than any display. It was not the silence of absence, but of witness. A silence that demands listening. For decades, Germany lived between remembrance and renewal. The wounds of war had healed on the surface, but not in memory. Older generations avoided the subject. Younger ones demanded answers. They asked their parents and grandparents, "Where were you? What did you know?" And often, the answers came not as words but as pauses, the kind that stretched too long to be forgotten. It was in those silences that the ghosts of the Gestapo found their truest form, not as villains from another age, but as shadows of fear that still lived in human hesitation, in the reluctance to speak. Historians, archivists, and survivors gave the ghosts names again. They traced files, cross-referenced records, restored the stories of those who had vanished into the bureaucracy of terror. Each recovered document was a small act of defiance against oblivion. Each testimony reopened the door to humanity long denied. What once had been used to erase forms, signatures, orders now became instruments of remembrance. The Gestapo's meticulous documentation, meant to control the living, ended up preserving the truth for the future. Irony had turned into justice, yet remembrance, as powerful as it is, carries its own burden. The more the world learned about the Gestapo, the more terrifyingly ordinary it seemed. The men who had signed execution orders were not all sadists or fanatics. Many were bureaucrats, husbands, fathers, men who believed in rules and order. That realization unsettled the post-war conscience more deeply than any revelation of horror, for it meant that the line between decency and cruelty is perilously thin, and that evil, when it comes, often wears the face of the familiar. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt itself into a democracy, remembrance became law. School children visited memorials as part of their education. Television documentaries replayed stories of denunciation and fear. Streets were renamed for resistance fighters. Small brass plaques, the Stolperstein, were laid before houses, each one bearing a name, a date, a reminder that someone had once been taken from that doorstep and never returned. These small acts of memory transformed the landscape. The past was no longer hidden. It was acknowledged, step by step, stone by stone. But remembrance was not confined to Germany. Across Europe, the echo of the Gestapo lingered in other nations' own reckonings. In France, Poland, the Netherlands, Austria, and beyond, the memory of occupation remained sharp. The Gestapo had not only been Germany's instrument, it had been a European experience of fear. The ghosts it left behind did not respect borders. They became part of a collective memory, one that still warns whenever states demand obedience without conscience, or when citizens trade freedom for safety. The Gestapo became a symbol, a word that needs no translation. As the 20th century waned, the last survivors of the Gestapo's prisons grew old. Their voices, frail yet unwavering, became treasures of moral clarity. They spoke not with hatred but with warning. They reminded the world that the Gestapo had not risen overnight. It had begun with small compromises. A law here, a silence there. A neighbor reported, a protest ignored. Terror, they said, is not born in screams, but in whispers. And it is in those whispers that the next generation must learn to listen. Today, the sites where the Gestapo once ruled are filled with light and visitors. School groups wander through exhibition halls, reading the words of prisoners carved into plaster nearly a century ago. Historians guide them through files that once condemned men and women to death. Outside, the city hums alive, free and forgetful. Yet for a few quiet moments, those who enter these spaces fall silent. They sense the presence of the past, not as threat, but as lesson. Memory, fragile yet enduring, holds them still. The Gestapo's story ends not in vengeance, but in awareness. Its defeat was not complete when its officers were hanged or its offices destroyed. It was complete when the world learned to recognize its reflection. Every time a person questions authority rather than obeys blindly, every time a neighbor chooses compassion over suspicion, every time a society protects truth over comfort, that is where the Gestapo finally dies again, piece by piece, in the conscience of the living. The ghosts of power have not vanished. They still appear in new forms in surveillance that overreaches, in governments that claim necessity as excuse, in citizens who prefer safety to freedom. But the memory of the Gestapo stands as a barrier. It whispers from museums, from books, from the testimony of the few who still remember the sound of those boots on the stairs. It warns that tyranny need not march loudly. It can walk softly, wearing the language of law and the promise of order. And so, in the quiet hours of history, the Gestapo remains both memory and mirror. Its echo reminds us that freedom is not inherited but maintained, that silence is never neutral, and that the price of forgetting is always repetition. The story of the Gestapo does not belong to the past alone. It belongs to every age that must choose between fear and courage, between obedience and conscience. As the lights dim in the museums, as the last visitors leave, and the doors close for the night, the silence returns. It is deep and resonant, but no longer the silence of terror. It is the silence of reflection of a world that remembers. The same walls that once absorbed cries now hold echoes of education and truth. In their stillness, they carry the promise that memory, however fragile, can outlast fear. And somewhere, in that silence, the ghosts finally rest, not because they are forgotten, but because they are remembered. The history of the Gestapo ends not with power, but with the quiet defiance of those who remember what power can do. The last word belongs not to the oppressors, but to the voices they tried to silence. Those voices continue to speak softly, endlessly, across time. They remind us that conscience is the truest form of resistance, and that remembrance, more than justice, is what keeps humanity awake.